Chapter 34. With the drums and bugle calls muffled by a damp morning mist, the army marched back along the path it had taken the day before. The night attack had revealed the Persians' intention to fight, but if they expected to see a tired, half-beaten enemy, they were to be disappointed. The Redcoats' advance was slow and steady, their boots thumping hard against the dusty ground as they retraced their steps. It would be a short march. The enemy's attack had stopped the British column before it had gone more than a few miles towards Bashir, and the red-coated army marched with purpose, the men looking ahead with anticipation, waiting for the enemy to be revealed. This time they advanced knowing they faced battle. A sharp, cold wind blew over the redcoats as they advanced. It soon dispelled the morning mist, stirring the battalion colours and revealing the enemy army drawn up and ready for battle. Whilst the Persian cavalry had been harassing the British column, the bulk of their infantry had marched down from the safety of the high ground and taken up position between the column and the village of Kush-Ab. They formed one long, continuous line, their left flank tethered on the walled village itself, their right secured by a thick grove of date trees. There were two hillocks in the centre of the line, and the Persian commander had wisely chosen these as the best position to sight his artillery. The raised ground gave them a clear line of sight towards the British force, which would be forced to advance across the open plain if they chose to assault the Persian line. The two hillocks would become the bastions of the enemy line, natural redoubts that would shore up the centre of the formation. With two strong points in the centre and both flanks secure, it was a powerful defensive position. The redcoats looked ahead and wondered what it would be like to attack the Persians' position. Their fears built as they saw what they must endure. The British command certain to order an attack now that the enemy had finally obliged and offered them the battle they sought. The Persian general had chosen to fight. He had picked his ground, and his army now waited to see if the British commanders would take the bait and attack. With Outram still shaking off the effects of his fall, command of the army had reverted to General Stalker. He would not disappoint the enemy. The British infantry advanced and took up position opposite the Persian line. As they waited, the men sucked on their canteens of precious water while the rest of the British expeditionary force manoeuvred into position. The light cavalry were sent to guard Stalker's right flank. He had far too few sabres to cover all his options, so he massed his cavalry opposite the bulk of the Persian general's horsemen. The two regiments were under strength and horribly outnumbered, but he could not risk letting the Persian general unleash his own troopers without opposition. The 3rd Bombay Lights and the men of the Poona Horse would have to protect the infantry's flank, no matter what the cost. The success of any assault, indeed the success of the entire campaign, relied on their willingness to hold back the horde of enemy horsemen. The infantry would not be left to advance alone. The expeditionary force had 2 batteries of foot artillery and 1 of horse, a total of 18 guns. The 3 batteries had been sighted along the length of the line. The gunners' job that day would be simple. They would fire as the infantry advanced, their round shot and shells certain to work a dreadful destruction on the tightly packed ranks of the Persian defensive line. But to succeed, the artillery officers would have to be unerringly accurate and demonstrate the very highest level of skill, with not a single shot wasted. Stalker was relying on his artillery to batter the Persians into submission before the infantry arrived to launch their assault. If they failed, and the enemy line was left intact, the Persian infantry would be allowed to deliver volleys of such power that the redcoats would be butchered no matter how courageously they advanced. The plan was simple, but it relied on each of the 3 branches of the army working together. If one should fail, the whole expeditionary force would be hard-pressed to avoid being destroyed. Stalker and his officers had done all they could, It was now down to the rank and file to achieve the victory they so desperately desired. The enemy cannon opened fire. Even from far out on the right flank, Jack could see the pencil-thin trace the round shot left as they seared through the pale blue morning sky, racing towards the two red lines that advanced towards the Persian position. They smashed into the ground in front of the first rank, before flying high into the air and over the heads of the rearmost. The redcoats marched on in silence, ignoring the temptation to jeer at the enemy's failure. The British artillery replied. Their guns were of a smaller calibre than those of the Persian army, the round shot they fired lighter and less powerful. The British gunners had waited to be called into action. They had sweated as they hauled their beloved cannon across country, their trial so much greater than that of the marching infantry. They had endured the same bitter night as the infantry, forced to suffer the enemy barrage without being able to reply. Finally, they had been given the order they had waited so long for, and they served their weapons with a will as they opened fire on the strongly positioned Persian army. The British gunners had not been given long to study the distances. They had been forced to rush the guns into the line as the expeditionary force moved on to the attack, the hasty advance denying them the opportunity to plot their barrage with their usual mathematical precision. Still, their first volley smashed into the Persian ranks with dreadful effect, every round shot working a terrible slaughter on the packed ranks of the enemy. "Bloody good shooting, what?" Jack turned and saw that Lieutenant Arthur Moore, the Bombay Lights adjutant, had ridden across to join him. Jack had been given little chance to converse with any of his fellow officers. He'd given Captain Forbes a terse summary of the night's activity when he had finally brought his squadron back to join the rest of the regiment. If his new commander approved of his efforts during the long, wearing night, he made no mention of it. He said little before leaving Jack in command of his squadron and riding to take his place at the head of the regiment as it formed on the right flank of the advancing infantrymen. Now the regiment's adjutant had found a moment to ride across and spend a moment with their new captain, and Jack was pleased to be able to share his thoughts with another officer. "It's about time the damn gunners made themselves useful. It would have been a waste of time to have hauled their sorry backsides all this way for nothing." Jack welcomed the adjutant with a wry observation. Moore guffawed at the forthright sentiments. "You have that right, old man. Still, let's hope they save some for us. We don't want to let the enemy skedaddling before we have the chance to be about them." Jack had to bite his tongue at the naive words. "Let's hope." He tried to sound enthusiastic. He did not think he succeeded. Moore nodded in approval anyway. He sat at Jack's side, gnawing the ends of his moustache, and Jack saw the tension in the younger officer's body. Moore held the reins so hard that his hands quivered with the effort, and there was the faintest sheen of perspiration on his forehead. The lieutenant might have been the product of a privileged upbringing, but that would not save him when the lead started to fly. Jack had known many such officers. Some were brave souls who readily shared their men's danger and demonstrated the true qualities of leader. Others were callow fools who shirked the fight once the battle had started and deserved nothing more than scorn and derision. Jack had learnt not to make a judgment simply on the basis of a man's accent or manner. Battle would reveal his true character, and until then Jack did his best to keep an open mind. "The men did well last night. You must be proud of them." He offered the praise in an attempt to get the lieutenant talking. He could see the man's fear. "They are good fellows," Moore answered, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. The young officer shook himself before fixing Jack with a cheery grin that went nowhere close to his pale eyes. "I think you did a pretty good job yourself. I heard Kot Daffodar Khan call you a devil. He said he had never seen a faster blade." Jack smiled tightly. He was not good at accepting praise. "I did what had to be done. Nothing more." "If slaying half the bloody Persian army by yourself is doing what had to be done, then I'm bloody glad you're on our side, old man." Moore held his reins a little easier as he spoke. "Here we go. I bet that's for us." Both officers had spied the fast-moving galloper riding up to Captain Forbes. The arrival of one of Stalker's staff meant that orders were being delivered. "Let's see what his lordship has in store for us, shall we?" Moore invited Jack to join him as he rode towards the small gaggle of officers surrounding Captain Forbes, waiting to find out what Stalker was asking them to do. The 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry advanced in a line, its 2 squadrons riding side by side. Jack led the 2nd Squadron, comprising No. 5 and 6 Troop. He rode in the centre of the formation, with Lieutenant Moore at the head of one troop and Lieutenant Malcolmson on his left at the head of the other. The 2 troops advanced behind their officers in a line, 2 men deep. Both were under strength. Together they numbered just over 120 sabres. Behind the line of troopers, the trumpeters and the 2 cornets rode with their covering non-commissioned officers in the serfile rank, their eyes roving over the men, the daffodars pouncing on any whose horse was even a fraction out of its spacing. "March!" Forbes ordered the line forward, the command echoed by the troop leaders. The regiment eased forward, the horses moving gently, their slow, rolling gait needing to be controlled carefully as the roar of the cannons unsettled the mounts. To the regiment's left, the lines of infantry advanced steadily, the redcoats covering the ground rapidly. The enemy cannon fired without pause, their round shot roaring towards the twin lines like express trains thundering at full speed down the line. Each drove into the ground, digging wide channels in the soft surface before bouncing high in the air, careering onwards before striking the ground again and again, their impetus driving them on with an unstoppable fury. So far the first line was untouched, the enemy shot wasting its power on the ground around them. The second line was not so fortunate. Round shot aimed at their colleagues in the front line might have missed their target, but the heavy shots skipped back into the air, their trajectory lowered by the violent contact with the ground. They smashed into the second line, the force of the impact barely diminished, knocking men down so that the passage of the redcoats' advance was marked out with the crumpled bodies of the fallen. Jack looked back over his shoulder, studying his own men. The lines were already ragged, the troopers' exhaustion after the long night in the saddle taking its toll on their discipline. "Steady in the ranks!" Jack was not the only one concerned about what he saw. Lieutenant Moore snapped a series of orders, his face a furious scowl, his displeasure at the disorder in the ranks obvious. The line steadied, the daffodars barking at any man who let his horse move out of the precise formation, the frontage once again as regular and ordered as it would have been on the parade ground. Jack caught Moore's eye and acknowledged his subordinate's action with a nod of approval. "Trot!" Forbes ordered the increase in pace. Once again the command was repeated by the troop commanders and echoed by the trumpeters. The horses picked up speed, and the noise of their advance increasing. Tackle chimed and clinked as men and mounts went into the trot, the noise of the hooves drumming into the ground getting louder as the speed built. Jack looked ahead. The Persian line was covered in a thin cloud of powder smoke, the dense ranks of the waiting infantry wafting in and out of view as the brisk breeze blew the rolling smoke along the enemy ranks. The British gunners kept up their rate of fire, their barrage puncturing the smoke cloud as round shot after round shot pounded into the Persian infantry. Even from a distance, Jack could see the damage they were inflicting. All along the enemy line, dozens of men were being hauled backwards, their bodies left in bloody heaps behind their fellows. The British artillery was exacting a dreadful toll on the huge blocks of men waiting for the red-coated line to arrive. Jack's horse threw its head, fighting the bit that he kept rammed hard in its mouth. The animal was caught in the passion of the advance. It could sense the tension in the air, its nostrils flaring as it caught the whiff of powder smoke being blown across the battlefield. It was as if the animal knew what lay ahead. In front of the Bombay Lights, the enemy cavalry waited. They numbered in their thousands. Jack could see the pennants on their lances fluttering in the breeze, the dense ranks appearing to shimmer, the constant movement mesmerizing to the eye. They stood watching the British cavalry advance, their ranks packed several men deep, their frontage much wider than that of the 2 squadrons of the Bombay Lights. If the enemy commander had known what he was about, his cavalry would already have been moving forward to counter the British advance. Meeting a cavalry charge from a stand was to invite disaster, but as yet the Persians gave no sign of moving. Jack looked to the rear and saw the dark blue coats of the Poona horse advancing behind his own regiment. They were a fine sight, the bright colour of their tightly woven pagdi adding a splash of gaudiness to the disciplined appearance of the ranks. The Poona horse were the Bombay Lights' support, and they held their own advance back, keeping a gap of around 400 yards between the 2 regiments. The spacing was vital. If the Poona horse were too close behind, they ran the risk of being disordered by the shock of the Bombay Lights' charge. Too far behind, and they would be unable to offer support if the enemy started to gain the upper hand. It took fine judgment to maintain the right gap, and Jack hoped the commander of the Poona horse was up to the job. The 2 British cavalry regiments might have been outnumbered, but they had no choice but to advance. Left unopposed, the enemy cavalry would sweep forward, forcing the advancing British infantry into a square. The Persian horsemen would be thwarted, unable to close on the foot soldiers, yet once in their defensive formation, the infantry's advance would be stopped. The square would also leave the redcoats exposed to a dreadful danger. It might have been the best defence against cavalry, but it left the packed ranks horribly vulnerable to artillery fire and the musket volleys of the Persian infantry. Any enemy fire would shred the dense formation, the tight files blown apart. The cavalry could then return and pour into the gaps, spreading a dreadful carnage amongst the remnants of the square. If the British infantry were forced to form a square, the battle was lost. The 2 British cavalry regiments had to advance and counter the superior numbers of enemy cavalry, or the whole attack was doomed to failure. "Gallop!" Jack heard the tremor in Forbes's voice as he bellowed the penultimate command in the series of orders that would bring the Bombay Lights into action. He could feel his horse quiver underneath him as it increased its speed, the beast shuddering with the sheer joy of being allowed to run. "Charge!" With 50 yards to go, Forbes screamed the last command. The trumpeters challenged the gods as they sounded the beautiful, haunting call. The troopers released their horses, giving them their heads, summoning the very last vestiges of speed. They hammered towards the stationary enemy cavalry, their sabres reaching forward, every man thrilling to the wild glory of the charge. Jack was filled with the madness. He could feel it searing through his veins. It resonated deep in his soul, every fibre of his being tingling with the insanity of galloping against an enemy horde. The regiment raced forward, their voices roaring out as the men unleashed the cheer saved for this moment. The last yards flashed past, and the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry charged into action. Chapter 35. The Bombay Lights pummeled into the Persian cavalry. The sound of the impact was dreadful, the fast-moving horsemen smashing into their stationary enemy. Some of the British riders were driven onto the lance points of the waiting enemy, the speed of the charge leaving them no time to swerve away from the razor-sharp weapons that waited for them. But once past the tips of the lances, the British riders were safe. and those still seated crashed their mounts into the Persian formation, flailing their weapons at the now defenceless enemy horsemen. The shock effect of the charge was brutal. The British cavalry's speed drove them deep into the enemy's ranks. Without any momentum of their own, the Persian horsemen were easy targets for the British, who cut their swords left and right, slashing them at the enemy. Dozens of Persian horsemen were scythed from their saddles in the first moments of the fight. Horses fled from the melee, their masters dying in the saddle, heads drooping onto their breasts, their bodies torn and bloody. Dying men and beasts fell to the ground, their final agonies ruthlessly crushed beneath the hooves of the horses left standing, their ruined flesh trodden into the dust. Despite the carnage, the Bombay Lights continued to pound forward, driving the attack home. Jack had rushed past the lance points in a blur of movement, the terror of the moment flaring bright, a single prick of icy fear stabbing deep in his guts before he was safe. He hacked his sword at the first enemy, a wild swing driven by anger and the lust for battle. It cut through the air before slicing into his target's face, the sharpened steel meeting no resistance as it found its first victim. The impetus of the charge drove him forward, so that he never saw the man fall. He was past another enemy before he could recover his sword, his horse moving faster than he could react. He swung the blade back and forth, cutting at the figures that raced past, the enemy ranks splintering around him as he drove deep into their formation. A riderless horse thumped into his flank, its eyes wide in terror, its flared nostrils caked in foam. It slowed his momentum, and he reined his own horse hard round, spurring it into the enemy that surrounded him. He yelled as he fought, the wild battle cry forced from his lips. A face turned towards him, the henna-edged eyes bright beneath the tall, conical hat. The man's fear was obvious, and his mouth opened to scream in terror as Jack rode straight for him. The scream never came. Jack thrust his tulwar forward, punching it into the man's throat, silencing the shriek of horror with a torrent of blood. He rode on, forcing his horse into the press of bodies. He aimed his sword at another Persian rider, but the man swerved his horse to one side, and Jack's blade flashed past. He was given no chance for a second blow as the man gouged his spurs backwards, galloping his horse free of the melee and away from the vicious sabres that had slain so many of his comrades. Not all the enemy were so quick to flee. A lance was thrust at Jack, its sharpened point scoring across the top of his thigh. There was no time to see who had attacked him, so he simply thrust his sword at the closest enemy. A fast-moving lance parried the blade, and he bellowed in rage as he failed to land a telling blow. A trooper from the Bombay Lights barged past, his face splattered with blood from a wound to his scalp. The man rose in his saddle, standing tall before thumping his sabre down onto a Persian head, the sickening sound of bones crunching clearly audible over the roar of the fighting. The trooper rode on, and Jack spurred his horse, driving it into another group of Persian horsemen. They tried to turn from his path, but they were slow and he was fast. His tulwar snatched away the throat of the first, the spray of blood bright in the morning sunlight. He recovered the blade and cut it hard above his horse's ears, slicing it into another man's side, screaming an incoherent curse of anger and fear, fighting like a creature from a nightmare let loose on the battlefield. His arm ached from the blows he had landed, his stomach churned with fear, his throat choked on the dreadful stench of battle, the air thick with the reek of blood and opened bowels. But still, he hacked at the enemy, slashing and cutting with his tulwar, fighting any who did not run. The press of bodies around him eased, and he twisted in the saddle, seeking more victims for his blade. But the last of the enemy were backing away, forcing their trembling horses from the horror of the British charge. The Persians broke, throwing away their lances in their haste to escape. The Bombay Lights slashed at the enemy, mercilessly cutting down men even as they tried to flee. The carnage turned the retreat into a rout, and the Persian horsemen streamed away in a wild mob, their ranks shattered by the dreadful power of the controlled charge. "Walk!" Jack heard Forbes, but could not see him. A dazed Persian horseman staggered past on foot, his sabre hanging uselessly from its strap around his wrist. The man's face was a mask of blood, and Jack let him go, the mad lust of the charge slipping away as quickly as the Persian cavalry had retreated. "Halt!" Jack looked round the disordered ranks of the Bombay Lights. He could see the delight on the troopers' faces. They raised their bloodied sabres, shouting to the heavens as their victory sank in, whooping and cackling in delight, the spectre of death that had ridden with the regiment retreating as they realized that they had come through their first fight unscathed. "Reform the ranks! Officers to me!" Forbes rode past. His stern face betrayed no joy at his men's celebration. He repeated the instruction as he continued on through his command, demanding order. The Bombay Lights might have broken the enemy's cavalry, but the battle was far from over. "Captain Fenris!" Forbes had to bellow to be heard. The gunners from both sides were engaged in a deadly duel, neither side slackening the pace of their cannonade. The British infantry marched into the fire, their bloodied ranks advancing no matter how many men were gorged from the lines. "Sir?" Jack rode forward. Forbes fixed him with an eager stare. The captain's face was slick with sweat, and Jack saw the blood-stained sabre held at his side. The commander of the Bombay Lights was clearly leading his men from the front. "I am sending one squadron after the enemy to ensure they do not rally. I want you to take your squadron and bring them behind the enemy's flank. Try to get behind their gunners on that closest hillock." Jack saw immediately what Forbes intended. With the cavalry streaming away, the Persian flank was dangerously exposed. The 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry was perfectly positioned to exploit the advantage. "Sir." He turned his horse and rode back to his command, which was quickly and efficiently reforming after the chaos of the charge. Both of his lieutenants were there, their swords bloody testament to their having joined in the fight. Half a dozen men were missing, their bodies strewn across the ground where the squadron had fought the enemy cavalry. There was no time to wonder who had fallen and who had survived. If the Bombay Lights were to make good on what they had won, they had to move, and move swiftly. Knightley felt his hands shaking. He could see his sword quivering, and he tried to force his muscles to stay still. He couldn't do it. Another volley of artillery slashed across the sky. He could see the trace of the round shot. They arced high into the clear morning air before racing downwards and rushing towards the twin red lines that marched across the sandy plain. He had never known fear like it. He wanted to turn, to run to the rear, yet he was firmly tethered by the responsibility of his command. No matter how much the fear built, he could do nothing but march onwards, like some new-fangled automaton, step after step, striding towards the oblivion of his death. His terror bubbled up. He felt it swallow his soul in its remorseless black grip. He wanted to cry, to release the emotion, but he could do nothing but walk forward, the pace of the advance relentless. More round shots smashed down behind the foremost line. The ground erupted in an enormous fountain of broken earth and shattered rock before the shot leapt back into the sky, screaming onward, its force barely altered by the violent contact. Knightley watched it ricochet high over his company before it crashed uselessly into the ground behind them. He forced his body to move, focusing his mind on placing his feet down on the sandy soil, each step an effort of will. The Persian artillery roared again, flinging more round shot at the long red lines that refused to turn. Knightley stayed in his place and walked forward into the enemy's fire. "Gallop!" Jack bellowed the command. He had led his men forward, sweeping them behind the Persian ranks towards the enemy's artillery. The sudden appearance of the British cavalry had an immediate effect on the Persian infantry. Under a dreadful barrage of artillery fire, and with their rear threatened by rampaging horsemen, the closest of them took the only option open to them. They ran. It was like watching a dam break. Jack was forced to speed up his squadron's pace lest they get caught up in the fleeing troops. It was tempting to turn his men and drive them at the broken infantry, who would have been easy targets for the hard-riding horsemen, but it was not what he had been ordered to do. Forbes had seen the opportunity, and so Jack moved his 2 troops in a wide arc, ready to bear down on the rear of the Persian artillery, which was still exacting a dreadful toll on the advancing British infantry. The troopers upped the pace of the advance, responding to their commander's lead. The rattle of equipment and the clink of the metal scabbards increased as the horses pounded onwards, the men lowering their sabres to the engage as Jack led them towards the enemy guns. The Persian artillerymen never saw them coming. They were serving their weapons with intensity, thinking of nothing but loading their pieces as fast as they could, preparing the heavy guns to send yet another volley searing across the plain and into the red tide that flowed so steadily towards them. The thick cloud of powder smoke that billowed around the cannon hid the arrival of the Bombay Lights until the last moment. The British horsemen erupted from the smoke like creatures emerging from the depths of hell. Their horses were covered in gore, with still more splattered across their light blue uniforms, and their sabres were bloody to the hilt. They charged towards the enemy gunners, who could do nothing but stare in horror as their worst nightmare unfolded around them. Jack led his men from the front, his teeth clenched as he rode hard to the slaughter. There was none of the wild joy of the first charge. The enemy was defenceless, and the Bombay Lights were merciless as they charged for the second time that day. Their precious guns forgotten, the Persian gunners broke and ran for their lives. Yet there was nowhere for them to run to. The barren hilltop that seemed such an advantage when they had sighted the guns now turned into a killing ground. The gunners twisted and turned, trying to dodge the British horsemen, but for every rider avoided, there was another sabre attacking, the cavalrymen going about their bloody task with ruthless efficiency. A man tried to run past Jack's saddle. It took no more than a heartbeat to slash his bloody tulwar downwards, bludgeoning the unfortunate Persian to the ground with a single blow to the head. Another man dashed past on the other side, and Jack lashed out with his foot, kicking the man hard so that he stumbled into the path of a trooper's sabre. Jack held fast, leaving the rest of the butchery to his men. The task sickened him. The Persian gunners stood no chance. He watched a man with the stripes of a vekel on his sleeve kneel beside his beloved cannon, weeping with the shame of the defeat. A trooper rode past and severed his head from his neck. Another gunner lay on the ground, his hands clutched to the ruin of his face, his feet thrashing the ground with the dreadful agony. A British horseman rode past with a stolen Persian lance balanced in his hand. With a whoop of delight he thrust it downwards, driving it into the wounded gunner's chest, the shaft left pointing upwards like a gruesome standard. A cluster of gunners huddled together back to back, their rammers and handspikes held out like spears in an attempt to keep the marauding cavalry at bay. As Jack watched, one of his troopers rode hard at the group, his sabre held at the full stretch of his arm and pointing towards the closest gunner. At the last moment, his horse twisted away, unable to charge the vicious weapons that faced it. With a scream of victory, the gunner stepped forward and rammed a spike into the rider's side, striking him from the saddle. The action condemned the brave artilleryman. The gunner's attack left an opening in the pitiful huddle, and a group of Jack's troopers tore into them in a heartbeat. Sabres flashed, and the gunners were cut to the ground, their resistance finished in a brief flurry of sword strokes. The fight was over. The gunners had been massacred, their cannon silenced. Jack peered through the smoke and saw the Puna horse charging at the next hilltop, the second battery of Persian artillery about to be taken out of the fight. Far out on the plain, the British line still advanced, the pace faster now that the enemy barrage had been stopped. The redcoats no longer marched to fight. They had been denied the opportunity by the valour of the cavalry and the ruthless precision of their own artillery. The Persian army was broken, the huge blocks of infantry running for their lives. Only the right flank of the enemy horde remained at least partially intact. 3 battalions had escaped the British barrage, and now they were trying to withdraw in good order whilst the rest of their army ran in a mob, all cohesion gone, their ranks shattered, their morale ripped to shreds. 3 battalions, all that remained of an army, a few hundred left out of thousands. Chapter 36. Captain Forbes galloped onto the hillock where the Persian gunners had been butchered. He fixed his attention on Jack and rode straight for him. "Fenris, reform your squadron, quickly now." He snapped the order before turning and riding away. Jack had no breath left to reply. His throat was parched and his body felt like it had been battered from head to toe. A thin line of blood traced across his thigh from where the Persian lance had scored into his flesh, and now the wound was starting to hurt in earnest. He closed his eyes, forcing away the tiredness and the pain. The time for rest would come later. "Reform the ranks!" He bellowed the command, forcing his spine straight. The small of his back flared in agony, so he sheathed his bloody sword and pressed his fingers into the knotted muscles, trying to relieve some of the ache. He turned and saw the 2 Moore brothers shaking hands. The adjutant had ridden in with the regiment's commander and had seized the opportunity to share a moment's contact with his older brother. To Jack's surprise, he felt a spark of jealousy as he saw the bond between the 2 men. He had been alone for so long that he could scarcely understand what it would be like to share such an intimate connection. For him, relationships were fleeting, as substantial as a silk veil. They hid the loneliness for a while, nothing more. The thought of his loneliness made him think of Sarah. Although she was married, he sensed that she too was alone. They had clung to each other, aware of each other's needs. He summoned the picture of her face. He smiled as he conjured the spark of life in her eyes that so captivated him. He wanted nothing more than to see her again, to be with her once more. The image faded, the noise of the battle interrupting his thoughts. He opened his mouth to order his troop commander to his place, but shut it before the words could be formed. He would let the 2 brothers enjoy each other's company for a moment longer. Captain Forbes reined in beside him. Jack looked across and saw the strain on the young commander's face. "The regiment is doing well, sir." He offered the encouragement, watching Forbes carefully. "Thus far, perhaps." Forbes kept up his facade. "The day is not yet done." True. Jack wanted to somehow reassure the captain that he was leading his regiment on a day that would live long in its annals, but he did not know the man well enough, and he could not find the words that would break down the barrier of unfamiliarity. The squadron was reforming. It was slow, the men's tiredness obvious, their lathered horses close to exhaustion. Yet Forbes was correct. The day was not yet over. The left and centre of the Persian line might have been in full retreat, but its largely untouched right flank was still formed and ready to fight. Forbes looked Jack hard in the eyes. "We have more work to do, Captain Fenris. The Poona Horse are to pursue the enemy infantry. I want us to harry their right flank." Jack said nothing. He turned and looked back at his squadron, the ranks now standing silent and ready for orders. They had fought all night and had charged twice that day, but they would not be allowed to rest. He faced Forbes. "We're ready, sir." "Good." The commander of the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry offered a tight-lipped smile. "We're going to attack over there." He turned and pointed to the massed ranks of infantry battalions on the enemy's flank. The Bombay Lights had fought cavalry and artillery. Now they would face a horseman's worst fear. They would charge the bayonets of the Persian infantry. The squadron moved quickly and with purpose. They trotted down the hillock and turned to face the enemy's flank. The two lines of red-coated infantry were close now, yet they were still too far away to join the fight, the distance too great even for the power of the 64th's Enfield rifles. "Trot!" The cavalry wheeled to the left as Forbes led them towards the Persians' surviving flank. Their line was ragged, and the files were forced to work hard to maintain their spacings as they realigned the ranks so they could sweep onto the Persian infantry. The formation lacked the regimental precision with which it had started the day, the effects of the two vicious engagements showing in the blood-stained uniforms that had been slashed and battered by the enemy. Yet they still displayed a purpose that was chilling. The Persian infantry saw them coming. With the rest of their army in disarray and the steady lines of British infantry moving even closer, the enemy foot soldiers had been forced to begin a long and lonely retreat. Unlike their comrades, the 3 Sabreeze battalions moved in good order, marching in tight columns. They had witnessed the destruction of the artillery and seen their cavalry driven from the field, yet they were determined to fight on, to show that not all of the Persian force was so easily defeated. As the British cavalry trotted towards them, the Persian infantry saw only one course of action. The closest battalion, the 1st Kushkai Regiment of Fars, stopped and immediately began to reform, leaving the rest of their comrades to carry on the retreat. To the hoarse screams of their vehicles, the side of the battalion closest to the British cavalry turned to face outwards, the men shuffling into 3 deep ranks. Around them the rest of the troops marched to form the other 3 sides of the square. Calmly and without fuss, the battalion moved into the defensive formation that would keep it safe from the advancing British cavalry. Jack watched the manoeuvre as the Bombay Lights headed straight for the enemy infantry. He was impressed by the steadiness in the Persian ranks. The infantry battalion had seen its comrades routed, yet still it stood its ground, determined to see off the small band of cavalry that had already caused so much destruction that day. It was an easy decision for the Persian commander to make. The single squadron of horsemen numbered just over 100 riders. The square was made up of more than 500 infantrymen, each armed with a musket and a bayonet. The odds were so heavily in the Persians' favour that not even the sight of so many of their fellows retreating had deterred him from halting and preparing to fight off the remains of the British cavalry. At any moment, Jack expected Forbes to sound the halt, to bring the squadron to an impotent stop, far out of the range of the enemy's muskets. Yet, for a reason Jack could not fathom, the commander of the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry showed no sign of even pausing. The younger Moore rode at his shoulder, the adjutant belatedly drawing a sabre unblemished with blood. The 2 officers advanced a little way in front of the squadron, their attention focused on the force of Persian infantry that stood resolutely in their path. The Bombay Lights were at least 500 yards away when the front rank of infantry squatted to the ground, the butts of their muskets rammed hard into the soft, sandy soil, the bayonets held ready to rip out the guts of any horse foolish enough to venture close. Behind them, the two standing ranks presented their muskets, the tips of the bayonets reaching past the heads of the front rank. Still, the Bombay Lights rode on. If Forbes ordered the charge, they faced a long gallop right into a volley from the Persians' muskets. When the horses swerved away from the wall of bayonets, as they surely must, they would be forced to ride past the other side of the square, giving the rest of the Persian infantrymen the chance to open fire. It would be a massacre. If Forbes ordered the charge, he was committing 100 men and their horses to certain death. Still they pressed on. The line flowed swiftly across the plain, the steady trot closing the distance with surprising speed. Forbes stayed silent, never once looking away from the square. He sat his horse easily, his sabre held almost casually in his right hand, as if on an afternoon's hunt rather than heading directly into a Persian volley. Jack felt the fear churn in his stomach. He had once taken his place in a square, standing shaking as a force of enemy cavalry rushed towards his company. It was a memory that still haunted his dreams. His men had stood firm, defiant in the face of the enemy horsemen. The square had not broken, and they had blasted the cavalry from their saddles as they swirled around them, the horses unable to close on the wall of bayonets. Now he was riding towards a similar formation. He knew what would happen, yet he was powerless to stop it. He saw Forbes lift his sabre and pointed at the sky, preparing to give the command to begin the gallop that would soon give way to the madness of the charge. Jack fought off the fear. He went to draw his tulwar, but the blood on the blade had congealed in his scabbard and it would not come free. He tugged harder, breaking it loose before he raised it high, mirroring his commander's gesture. "Bombay Lights!" Forbes's voice cracked as he shouted for attention. "Bombay Lights!" The voice hardened, the words coming clear above the noise of the moving horsemen. Jack's exhaustion slipped away as he prepared for the final charge. He had come so far. He had stolen a place in society far above his own, and proved that an unwanted child from the foulest rookeries of London could achieve so much more than his station in life allowed. Now he would likely die on a foreign field in the service of his queen. He glanced round quickly. He saw the look of stony determination on the face of Lieutenant Moore, and the grim expressions of the troopers, who were following their officers into almost certain oblivion. He turned to face the front, focusing his attention on the tightly packed ranks of Sabri's infantry, who watched in astonishment as the fragile line of blue-coated cavalry advanced to attack. Forbes slashed his sword forward, pointing it at the square. Jack repeated the gesture, opening his mouth to echo the order that was about to follow. He was leading his men into battle. There was nowhere else on earth he would rather be. Chapter 37. "Gallop!" Forbes bellowed the command. The squadron picked up speed. The horses moved willingly, carrying their masters to the slaughter without hesitation. Jack never once took his eyes off the Persian square. Even as his horse powered forward, he watched the barrels of the muskets that pointed towards him. He was pulling away from his men, his charger faster than the mounts issued to his troopers. But he did not care. Nothing mattered save the need to reach the enemy and try to force a way into the wall of bayonets. The distance closed with terrifying speed. He could see the muskets wavering as the infantrymen struggled to hold them still, the heavy bayonets at the tip making the weapons unwieldy. A Persian officer stood with the second rank, Jack watched the fear etched on the man's face as he stared aghast at the racing cavalry. He saw too the determination as the enemy officer waited for the British horseman to come into range. The Persian officer opened his mouth. Jack was close enough to see the muskets steady, the infantry stifling their muscles as they braced for the brutal kick that would follow a heartbeat after they pulled their triggers. Forbes turned and glanced at his command. He caught Jack's eye. Jack tried to read the emotion in the man's gaze, but the stare was too intense. Forbes was still looking at him when the Persians fired. The storm of musket balls tore through the air. Jack flinched uncontrollably, his body reacting to the sound of the missiles scorching past. The volley smashed into the line of galloping troopers. Men were snatched from the saddle as the musket balls tore into their flesh. Horses were struck down, their bodies crashing to the ground, their riders thrown to the dusty soil. The sound of the dozen or more impacts was dreadful, like the meaty slap of a butcher slamming a fresh carcass onto the chopping block. The screaming began. Horses shrieked, their bellows of agony tearing at the hearts of the troopers who rode past the carnage unscathed. Men screamed, their bodies shattered by enemy bullets or by a violent connection with the ground. The Bombay lights did not falter. Even as they galloped forward, they closed the ranks, callously ignoring the fallen, thinking of nothing but reaching the enemy. They raced on, their bloodied sabres held ready for the Persians who stood in their path. Forbes still led them. His breeches ran with red from a bullet wound to his leg, but he charged onwards nonetheless, throwing his head back as he bellowed the final order that would send his precious regiment against the enemy that had killed so many of the men under his command. Charge! The men responded. They roared as they went, their terror released, and the regiment surged forward. Jack let the madness take him. He screamed as he raced forward, the certainty of his imminent death releasing a soul-searing shriek that came from the very core of his being. The Persian soldiers held their ground. The smoke of their volley billowed around them. The closest flank of the square stood firm, the vicious weapons bristling outwards, creating an obstacle that no horse could penetrate. Adjutant Moore was in the van. Forbes fell behind, his tiring horse slowing his progress. The younger of the two brothers would have seen the wall of bayonets ahead of him, the hundreds of faces standing behind the 17 inches of steel bayonet. He did not turn away. He held his line, spurring his horse hard. The willing animal tore towards the wall as if it were nothing more than a hedgerow on a day's hunt. Moore set his horse at the square. He released his sabre, letting it fall, trusting to the thick cord around his wrist to keep it at his side, both hands needed to control his mount. With a final, desperate yell, he urged the animal to jump. It soared up, its hooves scrabbling at the air as it tried to vault the wall of bayonets. They came for it the moment it left the ground. Dozens of sharpened steel blades tore at its flesh, the vicious points ripping through its soft underbelly. The Persian officer who had controlled the volley lifted his pistol and fired at the madman who had tried to break the square. The bullet took the animal in the side of the head, smashing through skull and brain, killing it in an instant. The stricken beast crashed into the Persian soldiers, crushing the nearest men, whole file smashed by the impact. It kicked out as it died, knocking more men to the ground, its iron-shod hooves breaking bones as they lashed out. Moore was thrown. His final roar of anger turned into a scream of terror as he went down with his horse. Captain Forbes watched in horror, yet still he did not pause. He shortened his reins, bunching them tightly into his left hand before spurring his own horse forward and leaping at the square, following Moore's line so that he jumped over the chaos the adjutant's dying horse had created. he was lucky. With so many Persians struck down by the falling horse, there were few bayonets left in position. He surged over the wall, landing on the far side without coming to harm. He turned hard, slashing his sabre at the rear rank. He fought in silence, jaw clenched, teeth bared, attacking the files that had been crushed by Moore's wild charge, thrusting his horse at the last men left standing. His sword took a man in the face, and a visceral roar escaped his gritted teeth before he struck another Persian infantryman to the ground. He urged his horse forward, riding it over the bodies of the men he had killed, forcing an opening in what remained of the square's flank. His bloodied sabre hacked at a musket, battering it to one side before he thrust the point into the man's neck. He turned, his war cry faltering as he found no one left close enough to fight. There was a gap in the square. Jack had seen the two officers jump the wall of bayonets. He'd watched in mounting horror as Moore fell. The sight sickened him, and he cursed the fool's courage that had driven the young officer to the hopeless act. Then he saw Forbes land unharmed. He pulled at his own reins, realigning his horse so that he was heading for the place where the two officers had leapt, a sudden rush of hope surging through him. The wall ahead was blocked, the rear ranks still standing, their bayonets holding the line. Then Forbes struck. More men fell, and Jack saw the opening. He raced for the gap. He saw the look of terror on the Persian soldiers' faces as they realized what had happened. A thin-faced officer stepped forward, blocking the hole in the ranks, trying to seal it off alone. Jack roared in anger. He spurred his horse hard, urging it to find a final surge of speed. More Persian infantrymen were rushing to close the gap, their muskets raised, bayonets pushing forward. With a valiant effort, his horse responded. Jack felt its body tense beneath him as it strained with the last of its strength. The final yards rushed past, then Jack was slashing his tulwar downwards, beating away the bayonets that reached for him as he raced through the opening. He felt a blade slice through his left calf, the blinding flash of pain the last thing he noticed before he was through and into the centre of the square. He had been prepared to die, certain that the decision to charge the square would send the squadron to its doom. The sudden release and the hope of life surged through him, mixing with the horror and fear to fuel the intoxicating madness of battle. He cut down the nearest man, his blade ripping away the Persian's throat. He felt nothing as the man fell, his only thought to find more of the enemy to kill. The thin-faced officer who had tried to seal the gap came at him. His curved sabre slashed forward, but Jack blocked the blade, knocking it to one side, then kicked out, driving the point of his boot into the officer's face. The man reeled backwards, and Jack spurred forward, standing tall in his stirrups before smashing his sword down on the man's skull, killing him with the single blow. He reined his mount away, turning it back into the gap that had been created. There were bodies everywhere. Some lay still, their bloody flesh a testament to the skill of the two British officers who had made it into the square. Others were staggering to their feet, rushing to recover after having been knocked to the ground by Moore's falling horse. The gap was closing. Men from the opposite face were rushing forward, led by an experienced Vekil who had grabbed a section from the third rank without waiting for orders, knowing that his battalion faced destruction if they let the British cavalry into the square. Forbes had been surrounded and forced into a desperate defence against half a dozen bayonets. More men were being summoned to the unequal fight, the Persian officers trying to end the resistance of the British cavalrymen who had found a way into the square. Adjutant Moore was pinned under his fallen horse. He fought on, slashing his broken sword against any who came close, his body twisting and writhing as he tried to keep open the channel he had created. Jack saw the fresh rush of infantrymen coming and drove his horse at them. He slashed his sabre hard, cutting at the leader of the group, but the man was ready for him and blocked the blow with his musket, then grabbed at Jack's leg, trying to throw him from the saddle. Jack felt the man's fingers digging into the flesh of his thigh like claws, and he roared in building frustration as he brought his tulwar down, chopping the hilt onto the top of the man's head. The Vekel fell away, and Jack threw his horse round, thinking to rush back in a final attempt to keep the opening free and give his troopers a way into the square. He was too late. The rest of the Vekel's squad had rushed past as their leader wrestled with the foreign horsemen. Already they were reaching the opening. The gap was being sealed off. The British officers would soon be trapped. Cut off and alone, they would not stand a chance. Chapter 38. Lieutenant Moore hit the square like a knight of old. The huge officer was mounted on the biggest charger in the battalion, and he thundered into the Persian infantry's reforming ranks, using his horse as a living battering ram to force an opening. Men were knocked flying as the huge animal smashed through the files, their bodies broken by the force of the impact. Moore slashed at those left standing, cutting a bloody swathe through the Persian flank. As soon as he had broken through the shattered ranks, he reined his horse round hard, turning into the wall of bayonets that stood on his flank. He battered his sword down as he turned. The heavy blade made a vicious weapon in the hands of such a powerful man. Jack rode into the melee. He cut a man down from behind, mercilessly slashing his tulwar against the back of the man's undefended head. He pushed his horse into the gap, cutting at another Persian infantryman, who stood in mute horror as he saw his comrades dying at the hands of the British officers. He caught the man in the neck, slicing his blade deep into the man's flesh, killing him before he could fight back. Moore fought like a man possessed, his blade never still as he thrust at the men around him. With dreadful skill he hammered his way through the Persian ranks, walking his horse over the bodies of the men he had killed, pressing forward, clearing a path that he lined with bloodied corpses. Jack realized what his lieutenant was trying to do, and he forced his own horse to follow, battering away the bayonets that reached up to stab at him. His horse staggered as it stepped on a corpse, but rallied quickly, steadying its footing just in time to allow Jack to thrust the point of his tulwar into a man's face moments before the Persian had been about to drive a bayonet into the animal's breast. He urged his mount on, joining Moore in his attempt to reach his fallen brother. Together they forced a path through the files, kicking out or thrashing their sabres at anyone who tried to block their path. The Persian infantrymen began to step back, terrified of the two bloody warriors who fought with such intensity. They reached the younger Moore's fallen horse, and Jack rode past the trapped officer, forcing the closest enemy soldiers away. One man risked an attack, coming at him from his left-hand side. Jack saw the blade and slashed his sabre round, but he was tiring, his reactions dulled by the constant struggle to stay alive, and the bayonet slipped past his parry and drove deep into his horse's chest. The animal staggered, and the Persian soldier shrieked in triumph, but it was a short-lived moment of joy. Jack kicked his feet free of the stirrups the moment he felt his horse stagger and vaulted clear, landing on the balls of his feet as his mount toppled to one side. He hammered the hilt of his sword forward, smashing it into the enemy soldier's face and bludgeoning him to the ground. He felt the rage course through him and punched the sword down, driving the tip deep into the fallen man's heart. The solidity of the ground beneath his feet came as a relief. This was the type of fighting he knew best, and he threw himself at the closest enemy. The bayonet-tipped muskets lunged forward, but he had seen it all before, and it was easy to let them come, swaying out of their way before counter-attacking, slashing his own blade forward and cutting down the men who were trying to kill him. The closest men backed away, and Jack snatched his revolver out of its holster. In one practiced move, he swung it up and aimed at the press of bodies to his front. There was just time to register the horror on the dark faces before he opened fire. At such short range, The revolver was brutally effective, and each shot knocked a man to the ground. The rest of the Bombay Lights hit the square. Their officers had rushed ahead, using the speed of their superior horses to take the fight to the Persians. Now the troopers poured through the square's broken face, riding over the bodies of the dead and the dying. A handful of Persians still stood in the shredded ranks, and they fought hard, striking men from the saddle or stabbing at the horses that raced past them. But there were too many gaps, and the line collapsed as the Bombay Lights cut their way in. The rest of the square did not stand a chance. The British cavalry attacked without pause, the pace of the charge barely checked by the men they rode down. They smashed into the backs of the other flanks, cutting down the men in swathes, their bloody sabres working furiously. Without pause, they rode back and forth, striking man after man from their feet. The centre of the square became a charnel house. The ground churned into a bloody quagmire. With his revolver empty, Jack turned and ran to the side of the younger Moor, who still lay trapped under his fallen horse. The Persian troops were trying to run, but the British horsemen were everywhere, spurring mercilessly over any man who tried to flee, their faces twisted in dreadful masks of hate as they went about the bloody task with brutal efficiency. Moore slashed his broken sabre upwards as he sensed Jack approaching. "For fuck's sake, it's Fenris!" Jack bellowed as he was forced to dodge back sharply. The adjutant's weapon had snapped midway up to the blade, but the blood that was smeared on what remained showed that he had still used the weapon to effect. Jack saw the flare of recognition on Moore's face, and he bent forward and heaved at the body of the dead horse that had the younger officer trapped. The animal was smothered in blood, and his hands slipped as they tried to get a grip on the slick, matted coat. He lowered his shoulder and pressed it hard against the animal's flank. He grunted with the effort, but managed to move the beast a fraction. It was enough for Moore to scramble free. The lower half of his uniform was sodden with blood, but he appeared to be largely intact. His brother left the slaughter and came towards them, his huge horse lathered in sweat. "You're a damn fool!" The older Moor's face was twisted with anger, and for a moment Jack thought he would strike his brother down. The younger sibling threw his head back and bellowed with the sheer joy of being alive, then stepped forward and slapped his brother hard on the thigh. "You always were a soulless bastard." Jack turned away. He walked across to the body of his dead horse, feeling the remorse of having led the brave beast to its death. "You coming?" Jack turned to face the two brothers. The adjutant had slipped a foot into his brother's stirrup and taken a firm hold on the back of the saddle. Jack shook his head. "Thanks for your help, old man." Jack waved the brothers away. His attention was focused on two figures who were trying to flee unnoticed amidst the rout of the Persian army's centre. The men wore a strange uniform, one wholly different from that sported by the rest of the Persian army, a uniform that had no right to be there. Jack had recognized it at once. He had fought against men with similar dark blue coats and spiked helmets. Then he had been a red-coated officer, leading his troops against the enemy's prepared position on the far bank of the Alma River. Now he saw two men wearing the same uniform, and he broke into a run, forcing his tired body to move, chasing after the officers dressed in the uniform of the Russian Empire. He forgot the broken square and the staggering victory the Bombay Lights had earned. Ballard had taught him well, and Jack knew that the men trying to escape the blood and carnage of the battlefield held the answer to the riddle of the Persian spy. Chapter 39. Outram stood close to the British artillery as they limbered up their guns now that the fight was done. He surveyed the field of battle. his glasses panning slowly from side to side as he tried to understand the fight that he had missed. He'd only returned to command the army once the attack was well underway, the injury he had suffered the previous night keeping him from the field until the day was nearly done. His men had won him a spectacular victory, the efforts of the artillery and the heroism of the cavalry ending the Persian resistance before the bulk of his army could even be brought into play. Outram had achieved the first aim of his campaign. The Persian army would never again be able to face the British expeditionary force without remembering the fight at the village of Kush-Ab. He might not have been able to inflict a complete defeat and utterly destroy the Persian field army, but he had secured the foothold he needed so that he could launch the second phase of his campaign, which would see his force strike further inland. He would keep fighting until the Shah accepted defeat and sued for terms. The British public would be pleased, and his masters at Horse Guards would nod in approval. He might have hoped for more, but for now his men had done enough. Outram lit a cigar and watched as the British infantry marched towards the remains of the position that the Persian army had occupied. The enemy battalions had fled, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The British had been allowed to complete their advance in peace, the horror of the enemy bombardment fading as they pressed forward, the beat of the drums the only sound marking their passage. The redcoats were marching into a butcher's yard. The British artillery barrage had been dreadfully effective. Corpses lay in heaps, the mangled bodies a testament to the skill of the gunners. The ground was soaked in blood. Shattered limbs and ragged flesh smothered the sandy soil. The bowels of hell were revealed for all to see. The first British line marched on, driving after the remnants of the Persian infantry, which streamed away onto the plain behind where they had made their failed stand. The redcoats would not go far, for the enemy was retreating too fast, the Persian soldiers running from the visitors in disarray, discarding their weapons as they fled for their lives. The British cavalry rode after the broken ranks, doing their best to harry the retreat and add fresh impetus to the rout. Yet they had fought hard that day, and their horses were blown, the riders exhausted. Without fresh cavalry coming after them, much of the enemy infantry would be able to make good their escape, the shattered ranks heading back to the haven of the high ground and the places where they would be able to reform. The British army's shortage of cavalry was hampering the pursuit, denying Outram the ability to turn the Persian retreat into a catastrophic defeat. The general began to issue his orders. The young officers on his staff were sent galloping across the plain as they carried his instructions to the battalion commanders. The second line of British infantry was to halt as soon as it reached the ground where the Persian army had made its fateful stand. The 3 battalions in the rearmost line of the assault had taken the majority of the day's casualties, and Outram wanted to give them time to regroup and tend to their wounded. The men in the first line would be recalled to spend the rest of the day and the night that would follow on the field of battle. Outram had his victory, and now, finally, his men could rest. Lieutenant Knightley tried very hard not to be sick in front of his men. He walked amongst the bodies of enemy soldiers who had been living just a few hours before. He wondered how they had felt as the British barrage crashed into their ranks. Had they believed they would be the fortunate ones, that they could not be amongst the fallen? Or had they sensed death coming for them, somehow foreseeing what was going to befall them? He shivered as he remembered the long advance. The sight of the broken bodies made a mockery of his pathetic hopes that he would not die, that it would always be someone else whose body was broken, whose blood would flow to run into the dusty soil. He saw death in all its grotesque butchery, and knew then that it was only a matter of chance whether he lived or whether his own flesh was to be tattered and torn, his corpse left to lie forgotten on some foreign field. "Sir?" Knightley looked up into the calm face of his covering sergeant. He saw the pity in the man's eyes, and it shamed him. He forced himself to stand straighter and fight away the horror. "Yes, Sergeant." "Isn't that your chum over there?" Knightley looked in the direction of the sergeant's pointing arm. He was not surprised to see a hussar officer who had no business being in the field of battle. He shook off the dread that had crushed his spirit since the first cannon had opened fire. The battle was over, and he had survived. It was time to move on. He ordered his sergeant to fall the company out and to wait for orders. With his duty completed, he forced his fears away and trotted over to see just what his friend was up to. "Arthur? What the devil is going on?" Knightley puffed out his cheeks. The run had left him out of breath, and the hurried question had him gasping for air. He had arrived to see his friend holding 2 officers prisoner at gunpoint. Both were dressed in a uniform he did not recognize, but he was sure that neither would pose much of a threat. To see a raised weapon seemed rather melodramatic now that the battle was done. "Arthur, if these men have surrendered, you should put your gun down." He watched his friend's face closely. He saw the grime that covered his face, the flecks of blood that had been splattered across the cheeks. His uniform was filthy, and there was a thin crust of blood across one thigh. Knightley looked into his bloodshot eyes and saw the anger burning deep within. The taller of the 2 prisoners spread his arms, showing the British officers that he was unarmed. His face twitched, a spasm of what might have been fear twisting his mouth. Knightley had seen enough. "Arthur, put the gun down." He spoke slowly, as if it was to a difficult child. He was ignored. "Arthur!" The prisoner looked at Knightley, his eyes beseeching the red-coated officer to come to his aid. He opened his mouth, releasing a torrent of words. It was a language Knightley did not understand, but the meaning was clear. His fellow officer was tormenting the 2 men. Now that the battle was over, it was a gratuitous display, and Knightley knew he would have to bring it to an end. He thought about calling for his men to come to his aid. Jack and his 2 prisoners were partially hidden by a fold in the terrain that kept them out of sight of the redcoats, most of whom had already sunk to the ground, finding the few clear spaces not littered with bodies. Knightley did not have the heart to march over and force them back to their feet, so he sucked up his courage and tried to intercede once again. "Arthur, you're scaring the poor fellows witless. It's over now, the battle is finished. Let me take them back to battalion, you look done in." He tried to sound light-hearted, and even offered a short laugh as he attempted to shake off the tension in the air. He took a step forward as if he were going to push the gun aside. "Stay where you are." The command was snapped and angry. It stopped Knightley in his tracks. The young lieutenant felt the first flutter of fear deep in his belly. The battle was over, but he sensed the presence of death. Jack did his best to keep his gun steady. The exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, and his arm was aching from shoulder to wrist from having fought for so long. He'd heard Knightley arrive, but he did his best to pay the junior officer no heed. He kept his eyes fixed on the taller of the 2 Russians, who stared back without fear. It was only when the British lieutenant started to intervene that Jack was forced to act. "Stay where you are." His voice rasped as he gave the order. He looked into the Russian's eyes as he spoke to Knightley, sensing that the man understood his words. "I'm going to shoot these bastards if they don't tell me what I want to know." He saw the flicker of understanding, the slightest narrowing of the eyes as the Russian officer planned his next move. He knew he could not afford to drop his guard, not even for a single heartbeat. The Russian had a hard face. His left cheek bore a single thin scar that linked the corner of his mouth to his ear. His black hair was flecked with grey, his thin moustache showing the first signs of losing its colour. He looked more like a veteran soldier than a diplomatic observer. He stared at Jack for a long time. Jack met the scrutiny calmly, revealing nothing. The second officer, who was much younger, took a tiny half-step backwards, as if trying to edge away from the wild-eyed British officer of hussars who threatened murder on a battlefield. "I surrender." The older officer spoke in English for the first time. He spat to one side as if the language had left a sour taste in his mouth. "Now put the gun down, Captain, and I will offer you my parole." Jack smiled, the dirt that crusted his face pulling at his skin. "So you do speak English, but then of course you would. You wouldn't be here otherwise." "So, let us go." The Russian sneered, defiant even with the revolver aimed at him. "We are not here to fight. My country is not at war with yours. We are here as peaceful observers, nothing more." He scowled as he offered the response. It was clear that surrendering was not an easy thing for him to do. He turned his gaze back on Knightley. His eyes were like steel. There was no trace of fear, just a quiet, simmering anger. "Tell your friend he is to let me come with you. Tell him to let us go." "Arthur?" Knightley used his friend's name gently. It was clear that both men terrified him. He looked like a small boy summoned to bear witness to his first bare-knuckle fight. "I'll take them back to our lines." "You will do no such thing." Jack lifted the barrel of his gun an inch, aiming it directly at the Russian officer's forehead. The Russian turned away from the fresh-faced young officer who was being so roundly ignored, and focused his attention on the lean face of the man with the gun. "What do you want, Englishman?" "Tell me why you're here." The Russian smiled. It did not come close to reaching his eyes. "I am an observer." "Bollocks." Jack raised his voice for the first time. "You're a fucking spy! And you are a madman!" The Russian turned his pale eyes on Knightley again. "Get this man away from me!" "Shut your fucking muzzle," Jack snarled. "I know who you are and why you are here. I want to know the identity of the spy in the British camp, the spy who reports to you. You will tell me, or I will kill you." "Arthur!" Knightley had gone pale. "Be quiet!" Jack turned his head to glare at Knightley for the first time. It gave the Russian the opening he had waited for so patiently. He stepped forward and punched Jack hard, the blow rising fast and connecting squarely with the side of his head. Jack staggered away from the impact, his ear ringing and his vision clouding. The Russian closed on him quickly, fists hammering away at his body. Jack tried to twist away from the blows, but the Russian was relentless. Another punch smashed into his stomach, followed by a further one that knocked the revolver from his hand, sending it spinning away. He lifted his arms and tried to fight back, but he felt the strength leaving his body as the Russian pummeled at him without pause. A fist connected with his jaw, and he fell. He hit the ground hard. He tried to get back to his feet, but the Russian gave no quarter, kicking out with his heavy boots as Jack scrabbled in the dirt in a futile attempt to escape. A kick caught him in the pit of his gut, driving the air from his lungs. The pain flared bright and he couldn't breathe. He opened his mouth, but the dust choked him. He writhed onto his side, desperate to get some air into his lungs, but the Russian flopped on top of him, straddling his battered body. He tried to push him away, but the other man laughed and batted his flailing fists aside before reaching forward to take his throat in a vice-like grip. Jack was choking, his neck crushed under the Russian's thick fingers. His lungs screamed, the last of his breath roaring in his ears. In desperation, he tried to hammer his head forward, seeking to batter his way free. The Russian saw the attempt and forced Jack's head backwards, grinding it into the dust. Jack's vision faded. His lungs screamed out in agony, the need to breathe torturing him. He let his body go limp, his mind still trying to find a way out even as the Russian throttled him. He had one last chance, a final desperate gamble, a glimmer of hope as the darkness rushed forward to claim him. The younger Russian had leapt at Knightley in the moments after Jack had fallen. Knightley had not moved, unable to do anything but stare in horror at the sudden eruption of violence in front of him. The Russian officer was as fast as a viper, and he had his sword held at Knightley's throat before the British lieutenant could even think of drawing his own. He tried to step away, but the Russian pushed the blade forward, scoring it into the soft flesh at the base of Knightley's neck. The sharpened steel drew blood, and Knightley went completely still, held fast by the threat of death. He felt his body begin to shake. He watched the Russian batter Jack into bloody submission, powerless to intervene. He felt frozen, his whole being mesmerized by the vicious blade that hovered under his chin. He could smell the sheen of oil on the polished steel, the metallic tang catching in the back of his throat. With the point cutting into his flesh, he could do nothing but watch events in stupefied terror. The hard-eyed Russian officer stepped away from Jack's body. Knightley felt his throat close in horror as he saw the limp figure on the ground. His friend was dying no more than half a dozen paces away, and he could do nothing to save him. The Russian officer glanced once at Knightley, before bending to snatch the fallen revolver from the ground. With practiced ease, he brought the gun around, aiming it at the body of the Hussar officer who had tried to capture him. "No!" Knightley screamed, the dreadful sound exploding from his lips. He saw a thin smile appear on the Russian's scarred face as he cocked the weapon. He lifted the revolver a fraction of an inch, and then turned to look at Knightley. His eyes bored into the young officer, daring him to move. The revolver remained pointing at Jack's skull. At such close range, the Russian couldn't miss. He smirked at Knightley, relishing his distress. With a final twist of his lips, the Russian pulled the trigger. Chapter 40. The trigger clicked onto an empty chamber. Jack had used all his rounds in the final fight with the Persian infantry and had not had the opportunity to reload. The weapon was useless. He had been bluffing when he had threatened his two prisoners. The Russian's face betrayed his shock. He pulled the trigger again and again before throwing the gun to one side, his hands reaching for the saber at his side. Jack rose from the ground, roaring like a madman. He threw himself at the Russian, punching his right fist into the foreign officer's throat. It was a brutal blow, and the Russian staggered backwards, his hands clutching his crushed windpipe. Jack went after him without a moment's pause, his fists flashing at the man who had tried to kill him, smashing blow after blow into the Russian, who crumpled under the onslaught, his legs giving way beneath him. Jack lashed out as he fell, kicking the tip of his boot viciously into the man's throat, driving the clasping hands into the abused flesh, choking off the last of his breath. Knightley saw the fear flash in the younger Russian's face as he watched the man he had thought beaten rise from the ground and batter his fellow officer insensible. The tip of his sword wavered, and Knightley reacted without a thought, slashing his arm upwards, knocking the blade to one side. The Russian fell backwards, giving Knightley the freedom to finally draw his own sabre. It rasped from the metal scabbard, and he slashed it forward, forcing the Russian to jump away. As he cut at the Russian, a yelp of childish glee burst from his lips. He was fighting for the first time, and he felt invincible. He stamped forward, hammering his sword at his enemy, forgetting his fear. The Russian parried the blows, but the effort caused him to stagger, and Knightley thrust the point of the sword forward, sliding the sharp steel into the man's flesh. He could barely believe how easy it was. He pushed his weight behind the blade, driving it deep into the Russian's chest. When he looked up, He saw the agony reflected in his foe's eyes, his bitter surprise revealed in a look of abject horror. Knightley let go of the blade. It was stuck fast in the Russian's flesh, and he could not find the strength to wrench it free. He stared at the man's hand as it flapped at the blade, the fleshy tips of his fingers torn as they clasped the sharpened edge. The joy of killing faded, and the heat of victory was replaced with coldness, the shock of having killed a man freezing his soul. The Russian staggered forward. He yelled as he lurched into motion, a spew of foreign words rushing from his mouth before they were cut off in a torrent of blood. Knightley screamed, shrieking like a child confronting a monster from a nightmare. He was still screaming when the Russian rammed his own sword forward. It was thrust with the last of his strength, and it cut deep into Knightley's body. The Russian fell, his hand falling away from the blade he had buried in the British lieutenant's flesh. Knightley's fingers scrabbled at the Russian's sword. A wave of panic engulfed him, and he fell silent, unable to comprehend what had happened. He felt his strength ebb, and he fell to his knees. He tried to pull the blade from his own body, but it was stuck fast. Blood spilled down the length of the steel, smothering Knightley's clutching fingers. He screamed again, and then again, releasing the horror that surged through him. Jack had turned as soon as he heard the sounds of the fight. He watched as Knightley fought, recognizing the rage that took hold of the young officer. The struggle was short, the two men trading barely half a dozen blows before Knightley struck the Russian down. It was only when the lieutenant let go of his sabre that Jack lurched into motion. He knew what was about to happen, and he rushed forward, his cry of warning stuck in his tortured throat. He could do nothing as the Russian made his final thrust. He saw the sword pierce Knightley's flesh, and he moved quickly, reaching his friend's side just as he fell to his knees. Knightley's hands pawed at the blade in his flesh, but Jack knocked them to one side and eased him to the ground, setting him down in the dust as gently as he could. He didn't need to look at the thin sabre buried in Knightley's chest to know what was going to happen. He drew the young man's head into his lap, cradling him in his arms, the bitter futility of what had happened sending a surge of anger coursing through him. As he held Knightley close, he looked down at the ashen face of a boy about to die. "I'm sorry," Knightley choked as he spoke, the breath refusing to come. "You're going to be all right." Jack ran his fingers through the young officer's hair and hugged his head to him, as if he could stop what was to come. Knightley could not speak. A tremor ran through him, his body convulsing with fear. He was sobbing now, an incoherent stream of terror, as he realized he was about to die. Jack could do nothing but hold him tight, fighting against the darkness that threatened to lay claim to his very being. The young man's body went still. Jack looked down and fixed his eyes on the face that stared up at him. He was still watching as the final spark of life fled, to be replaced by glazed nothingness. Knightley was dead. "I told you to twist your bloody wrist." Jack felt a blackness engulf his soul. He placed Knightley's head gently on the ground and closed his eyes, trying to hold fast against the wave of bitter grief. The feeling passed. He opened his eyes once again and felt nothing. He slipped his hand forward and unbuckled the flap of Knightley's holster, pulling free the revolver that he knew had not been used that day. Then he got carefully to his feet and walked towards the first Russian officer. The man lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his hands twisted around his broken throat. Jack straddled his chest, crushing the man's tortured lungs, then threw the Russian's arms backwards and pinned them under his knees, leaving the man completely at his mercy. He looked down at the beaten officer. The man's eyes were glazed, so Jack slapped him hard around the cheeks, hitting him again and again until his vision focused. So, where were we? He spat a wad of bloody phlegm onto the Russian's chest. His own throat burned, and he could feel the place on his neck where the other man's fingers had dug into the soft flesh. He felt no compassion, no mercy. Who is the fucking spy? The Russian said nothing. He simply stared at Jack, the air rasping in his gullet as he tried to breathe through the ruin of his throat. Jack felt the solid shape of Knightley's revolver in his hand. The weight was reassuring, and he brought it around, placing it with care so that the barrel rested against the Russian's temple. Tell me who the damn spy is, or I'll blow you to kingdom come. He pressed the barrel into the soft flesh just under the Russian's hairline. He felt empty, his soul drained of all emotion. Tell me, you by-blow of a whore, or I'll fucking kill you. The Russian spat. The thick globule landed on Jack's chest and stuck there, hanging from the gore-splattered dolman before slowly falling away and landing on his blood-stained thigh. Jack leant forward. Then go to hell. As he whispered the words, he saw the flare of fear deep in the man's eyes. He pulled the trigger. The crash of the gun going off was loud. The retort echoed around them, the sudden noise somehow out of place even on what had been a field of battle. The Russian jerked in terror, and Jack nearly lost his balance. He had turned his wrist as he pulled the trigger. The bullet had scorched through the Russian's hair, missing his scalp by no more than half an inch. The other man went still. Jack stared down into his eyes, betraying no emotion. Slowly, carefully, he cocked the revolver for a second time, bringing another chamber under the hammer. Tell me who the spy is. The Russian began to shake. Jack could feel the tremors running through the man's body, yet he felt no remorse. He steadied his wrist and pulled the trigger for a second time. Again, the sound of the gun firing exploded around them. This time, Jack's aim had not been as careful, and the bullet caught the Russian's scalp, tearing a path through the man's hair, parting the delicate flesh on the very top of his head. The Russian screamed and jerked like a landed fish, but Jack did not move. He waited until his captive went still before he leant forward and spoke softly. There are 3 bullets left. One of them will kill you. Tell me who the spy is. The Russian closed his eyes. The blood from the wound to his scalp ran freely down his face, streaming in thick rivulets down his cheeks so that it looked like he was crying tears of blood. Jack waited. He counted to 10, and then slowly prepared the revolver to fire again. The click of the rotating chamber was loud in the silence. The Russian's eyes snapped open, blinking away the thick covering of blood. In my pocket. The words were slurred, fear thickening the man's accent, his crushed throat barely letting him speak. Jack didn't move. He simply stared down at the Russian, as if unmoved by the words he had waited so long to hear. Then, with a sudden flurry of movement, he cracked the revolver hard against the man's skull. The sound of the vicious impact was sickening. Jack leapt to his feet, immediately covering the Russian officer with the still loaded revolver. But the brutal blow had bludgeoned the man insensible. A thick stream of blood ran from his temple, and his head sagged to one side, all signs of consciousness gone. Jack tossed the revolver to the ground, then bent forward and started to rummage through the Russian officer's uniform. grunting in satisfaction as he tugged a thick sheaf of papers from the man's pocket. He stood back and flicked through them, his eyes scanning the neat copperplate script, the elegant sloping letters revealing to him what he had come so far to find. He had discovered the identity of the spy in the British camp. He looked down at the body of the man he had beaten senseless. He contemplated picking up the revolver and blowing the Russian to kingdom come. He turned his head and saw Knightley's staring blue eyes. The sight sickened him. He turned his back on the scene of so much blood and so much horror and walked away. He went to do murder. Chapter 41. Jack rode at Ballard's side on a horse borrowed from Outram's stable. It had not taken long to reveal all that he had discovered. If Ballard had been shocked by the revelation, he had not shown it. It had taken barely 30 minutes to secure Outram's permission for the 2 intelligence officers to leave the army and race back to Bashir to apprehend the enemy spy. They had left Palmer behind, the bodyguard ordered to guard their possessions and Ballard's papers. The 2 men would deal with the spy themselves. It was still not past midday, but already the redcoats were going about the gruesome task of sorting the dead from the still living. The battlefield was theirs, the victory complete. Jack and Ballard left the British army as victors of the field and went to finish the job they had started but which had been left unfinished for too long. The heavens opened. The afternoon sun was hidden behind a bank of thick, rolling clouds that had rushed across the sky to smother the brightness and shroud the land in a dark cloak. The 2 officers rode on regardless, paying the deluge no heed. They faced a long journey. They would ride on into the night, pushing their horses hard as they sought to cover the miles back to Bashir as quickly as they could. The crash of thunder and the crack of lightning split the sky. It was as if the gods had been angered by the slaughter and now raged in the heavens, their displeasure manifest in the violent storm. The road the 2 officers followed became little more than muddy slurry and sand, the slop splattering the horses and riders with a thin covering of foul-smelling muck. The rain fell constantly, driven almost horizontal by the biting northerly wind. The officers could do nothing but endure the tempest and ride onwards, their mission too vital to be turned aside by even the foulest conditions. Jack could not ever remember being so weary. His sword arm felt like lead, the muscles deadened by a night and day of fighting. His leg throbbed from the lance wound that was still untended. His throat burnt from the throttling the Russian officer had administered, and his spine felt as if it had been severed. Such was the pain in the small of his back. He ignored it all, driven on by the need for revenge on the person he blamed for so much of the suffering, the power of betrayal fueling his body past the point of exhaustion. The storm raged around him. Every minute was a torment, a torture that would never cease. He endured, staying in the saddle and forcing his horse forward, each step taking him closer to the confrontation he sought. He thought of nothing. He refused to dwell on the bitter battle or on the fight that had led to Knightley's death. He felt nothing, no anger, no grief, no remorse. He rode through the tempest, his soul empty. He rode to exact revenge. He would find the British spy whose identity the Russian papers had revealed, and he was ready to kill. They arrived in the dead hours before dawn. It was the time when the camp was at its quietest, the men left behind slumbering through the last of the night. No one remarked on their progress, the 2 weather-beaten officers left to pick their way through the empty spaces. With so many men with the main column, the camp felt eerily still, the tents silent, only shadows moving through the darkness. Ballard looked across at Jack. They had not spoken for hours, the only exchanges coming when they passed through the network of vedettes and pickets that ringed the British base, keeping it safe from marauding enemy cavalry. "Let's get this done." Jack nodded. He did his best to force away the exhaustion. He had one last duty to perform, then he could rest. They rode into the staff headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Shepherd had been left in command of a combined army and naval detachment to safeguard the encampment, whilst the column made its lightning attack on the Persians. In the small hours, the headquarters was quiet, only a handful of men left to work through the night. It did not take long for Ballard to rouse the duty officer, a Captain Campbell, who bustled out of the tent, his surprise at the summons clear. He took one look at the two officers' bedraggled attire and shouted for an orderly to bring coffee. "Do you want a detachment?" Campbell was brisk and to the point. Ballard had explained to him that they were going to arrest the spy who had dogged the campaign since the beginning. "No." Jack spoke for the first time. His voice was brittle. "As you wish." Campbell yawned, smothering his mouth with a meaty paw. "The first dispatch from the battle only arrived about an hour ago. You must have ridden hard." Jack said nothing. He reached for Knightley's revolver and set about reloading it. His exhaustion was like a lead bar pressing down on his soul. It took an effort to open the pouch on his belt that contained the ammunition, his hands fumbling with the clasp. The cartridges were dry under his fingertips, kept safe against the deluge. Campbell nodded at Jack's reaction. He had been in the Crimea and he knew what it felt like after a hard-fought battle. He turned to face Ballard. "Do you want anything further from me?" Ballard was looking at Jack. His face creased with concern. He was gambling his career on the events of the next hour. His only weapon was a battered and bloodied charlatan. For the first time, he had doubts. "No." Ballard spoke with finality. He turned and fixed Campbell with a grim smile. "We will deal with this ourselves." Sarah Draper sat at her writing table. She had risen early, long before dawn, unable to sleep any longer. She barely slept at all these days. Her nights were long, the charpoy she tried to rest in becoming a bed of thorns when she did lie down. So she wrote, passing the hours of darkness with only the hiss of a gas lamp for company, her paper and ink a solace against the loneliness that swamped her. The words she wrote comforted her. They had become her release, her salvation. There was a joy in creating images with nothing more than words, the dry, scribbled lines taking on another life as she recorded her thoughts and feelings. When she wrote, she could forget her life, passing into another place where the choices she had made meant nothing. There was just her and the words she chose, nothing more. She heard footsteps outside her tent. The heavy tread of army boots, scuffing the wooden boards she had arranged outside the tent's flap so that she would be spared from muck being traipsed into her abode. She heard the footsteps stop, the boots stomping loudly on the boards. She felt a frisson of fear. She expected no one. She spent the nights alone now, no longer seeking to force away her loneliness by taking a lover to her bed. She shook off the feeling of dread, forcing the anxiety from her thoughts. She was in the heart of the British camp. She was safe. The tent flap was thrown open. The rush of air was cold on her skin. She had time to stand and wrap her linen robe tight around her body before the intruder strode into the tent. "Hello, Sarah." Jack took a step forward, moving out of the shadows and into the meagre light cast by the solitary lamp. He heard her gasp of shock as she saw who had come to disturb her rest. He took another step, and then another. He knew how he looked, how he smelt. He was dressed in the horror of the battlefield, the grime and the blood a visceral reminder of the violence of the fight. He had not taken the time to clean himself, wanting to confront Sarah with the stain of other men's lives on his clothes, their blood on his hands. He wanted to shock her, to scare her, to somehow communicate just what she had done when she had intervened in the affairs of soldiers. For Sarah Draper was the spy that Jack had come all this way to kill. "Why do it?" Jack blurted out the question. He had spent hours thinking of what he would say when he confronted her. The long, miserable hours of the ride had given him plenty of time to imagine this moment, to taste what it would be like to denounce the woman whose bed he had shared. He had considered every emotion, but as she rose to face him, he felt nothing but the bitterness of betrayal. The question hung in the air. Sarah turned her back on him and carefully placed the steel pen she still carried on top of the paper she had been working on. She leant forward and straightened the papers, leaving them in a neat stack with the pen positioned carefully as a paperweight to stop them being disturbed in the storm she knew was coming. Her hands fell away from her robe and it opened round her, so that when she turned back to face Jack, he could see the outline of the body that had once been the source of such pleasure. She looked into his eyes, searching for an escape. Jack said nothing. He raised Knightley's revolver. The weapon was covered with dirt, the heavy handle still stained with the blood of the Russian officer. He saw Sarah's face appear over the tip of the barrel, her eyes filling the sight. Her hair was scraped back, tied behind her head, so that he could see the whole of her face. She took his breath away, the simple symmetry of her features making her one of the most startlingly beautiful women he had ever seen. He stared into her eyes, just as he had done so many times before. He saw the vitality, the spark of life they contained, the force that still captivated his soul. His finger curled around the trigger, taking up the slack. A single ounce of pressure, and the gun would fire. Then the beautiful eyes would glaze over, the life force fading to nothingness before it was replaced by the blank, lifeless stare of death. He had seen it before. He had watched the flicker of life leave Knightley's eyes, and now he would be the one who would end the same spark in Sarah's. He never saw her hand slip behind her back. He was lost in his thoughts, his mind in such turmoil that he didn't notice her slim fingers slide into the drawer of her writing desk. "I'm sorry, Arthur." Sarah spoke for the first time. The words meant nothing. Jack could not know that she was apologizing not for what she had done, but for what she was about to do. The slim pistol only fired a single bullet. It was small, tiny enough to fit into a man's pocket or a woman's purse. It was an expensive object crafted by the best gunsmith as a lady's weapon of last defense. Sarah Draper did not hesitate. She did not bother lifting the weapon, but instead fired it from her hip. The bullet hit Jack before he was fully aware of what was happening. It spun him round, the force of the impact knocking him backwards. His own gun roared, his finger tightening on instinct. But he was already falling backwards, and the bullet went wild, blasting through the tent's canvas roof. The agony seared through him. He felt the rush of blood pouring from the wound. The bullet had taken him high on his right arm, searing through his flesh, filling his world with pain. He went down, his bloodied body hitting the floor with all the grace of a falling brick. Sarah moved fast. She stepped past Jack, barely glancing at the man she had struck down, and threw back the tent flap, thinking of nothing but escape. A strong hand reached from out of the darkness and grabbed her arm, the fingers clawing into her flesh, stopping her headlong flight with a vice-like grip. "Going somewhere?" Ballard pulled hard, dragging her back into the tent. Sarah screamed. She shrieked a single word in the darkness, her anguish complete. Ballard was in no mood to be gentle. He smothered her mouth with his free hand. Without mercy, he twisted her arm behind her back and thrust her ahead of him into the tent. She struggled under his grip, trying to free herself, but Ballard was too strong. He pushed her backwards, sending her sprawling onto the charpoy. She leapt to her feet. Her hands twisted like claws and went for Ballard's face, her screech of rage like that of a wounded animal. She came at him fast, but he slapped her cheek, battering her back onto the camp bed. "Stay there," he growled the words. His hand stung from the blow he had given her, but he would not hesitate to repeat it if she tried to escape. Sarah lay sprawled on the charpoy. Her cheek was scarlet, the imprint of his hand clearly visible on her pale skin. Her robe was open, and Ballard saw the lithe body beneath. He turned away, refusing to be drawn by the sight. He saw Jack trying to get to his feet, blood oozing from the wound just below his shoulder. His face was pale, drained by the agony of the bullet. Ballard heard footsteps. He had time to turn to face the tent's entrance just as it was thrown open and a man burst in. He carried a naked blade, the bared steel glinting in the light of the gas lamp. Sarah had not screamed in terror. She had called for help. Chapter 42. Simon Montford rushed into the tent, his weapon drawn. He had been summoned by Sarah's dreadful scream, and he came in fighting. Ballard was no warrior. His hands fumbled clumsily for the sabre at his waist. He had never once drawn the weapon in anger, and now that danger loomed in front of him, he was terribly slow. Montford bellowed as he struck, giving Ballard no chance to defend himself. The blow speared through the Major's sparse flesh, the blade grating on the edge of a rib. Montford recovered the sword immediately, his face contorted with the rage of battle as he prepared the next strike. The commander of intelligence staggered to one side, his sabre undrawn, his hands clasping at the bloody tear in his side. The rapier came for him again as he stumbled away, but he was moving too fast, and the sharpened steel only managed to gouge a deep crevice in the flesh of his upper arm. His balance failed him, and he fell, sliding into the slick of blood already spilt across the tent's floor. Montfort was after him in a flash. Yet he held back the killing blow, giving his victim enough time to twist on the floor so that he lay on his back, his face lifting towards the man about to kill him. Ballard looked up and saw Montfort looming over him. The younger man's mouth twisted in a dreadful grimace as he prepared to thrust his sword into his opponent's heart. Montfort aimed the blow. His arm tensed and drew back as he gathered his strength for the killing strike. Ballard lifted his own arms, a final act of defiance as he saw his death reflected in the eyes of the man summoned to protect the spy. He watched the rapier coming for him, the tip aimed squarely at his heart, and he braced himself for the blow even as his mind recoiled from the thought that he was about to die. But he had forgotten the charlatan. Jack had dragged himself to his feet. The pain in his arm seared through his veins, but he refused to stay down. He saw Montfort looming over Ballard in the moment before he attacked hard and fast. He hammered his tulwar at Montfort's rapier, driving the blade wide even as it reached for Ballard's flesh. "Come on!" Jack fanned the flames of his anger. He recovered his sword and attacked again. The blow missed, but it drove Montfort backwards, and Jack stepped into the space, putting himself between his foe and his fallen commander. He cut his sword through the stale air, forcing the younger man into a desperate defence. He shouted again, his pain and anger released into one dreadful banshee wail as he flailed his sword at his latest enemy. Sarah screamed as he went past her. He looked like a creature from a nightmare. Blood dripped from the wound to his arm, and he was coated in the grime and filth of the battlefield, the stains of combat covering his uniform. Yet worse was the look on his face. It was the look of a killer. The face of a man who had witnessed so much death that he lived in a world of ghosts and shadows. The man she had taken to her bed had returned, and he terrified her. Montfort moved backwards. There was little room for manoeuvre, and he could not retreat for long. Jack hammered blows forward, flowing through the impacts. He had killed so many men. Their faces flashed in his mind. He relived the moments when he had struck them down, when they realized they were about to die. He screamed as he fought, haunted by the memories, driven half mad by the legacy of the deaths he had caused. He parried a half-hearted counter, twisting his wrist so that he deflected the rapier to one side. It gave him the opening he needed, and he thrust his tulwar forward, going for the killing stroke just as he had done so many times before. But Montfort was young and fast, and Jack was hurting and slow. Montfort threw himself to one side, a final despairing ploy to avoid the blade that reached for his flesh. Jack missed, his tulwar hitting nothing but air. Montfort saw the opening and punched his sword's guard into the wound to Jack's arm. The force of the merciless blow knocked Jack to the floor. His tulwar fell from his hand, his arm losing all sensation, agony flaring across his vision. He cried out, the explosion of sound torn from his lips. He saw Montfort's boot step forward, knowing the killing strike would follow. "No!" Jack heard the cry, but he did not know what it meant. He forced himself to move, levering himself to his feet, hearing his own sobs as the pain seared through him. His right arm was useless, so he snatched his tulwar from the ground with his left hand, lifting it up in a pathetic attempt to be ready to fight. But it was over. Ballard had come to his aid. He had plunged his sabre deep into Montfort's body, driving the steel in hard. Montfort's mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. He staggered, staying on his feet even with Ballard's blade buried in his flesh. Still he tried to fight, bringing his rapier round, his eyes flaring wide as he thrust it forward one last time. Jack saw the blow coming. Ballard's sabre was stuck fast, the naive mistake trapping the blade, leaving him defenceless. Jack would not watch another man die from the same feckless error. He lashed out, flailing his tulwar in a clumsy parry. The blow was awkward, but it swatted aside Montfort's rapier, blocking the thrust that would have struck Ballard's heart. Jack staggered, the impact jarring his battered body. But he had done enough. He forced himself to stand straight so that he was face to face with Montfort. The younger man's features were screwed tight against the agony. For a moment he stared into Jack's eyes, his hatred naked and exposed. Jack met the stare, not flinching from the younger man's gaze until it glazed over, death arriving fast to steal another life away. Montfort fell silently. As his body slipped to the floor, Jack saw Ballard's grim, bloodied face. It wore a look of horror, the closeness of death and the enormity of having killed a man for the first time only now registering in the man's mind. But Jack knew the fight was not yet over. He turned, ignoring the pain in his arm. He dropped his tulwar as he spied the fallen revolver. He bent to snatch it from the floor, cursing as the motion set off fresh waves of agony. But the familiarity of the weapon tethered him to who he was and why he was there. He stood straight. His right arm hung useless from his side, the searing torture of his wound denying him its use. So he held the revolver in his left hand, just as he did in battle. He walked forward, stepping carefully towards the cause of so much pain. He remembered the sight of the shattered bodies on the battlefield, the pathetic, twisted remains of men who had died at the hands of the enemy, an enemy who had been forewarned of the army's movements. He saw again the bloodied face of Knightley as he died, the dreadful terror in the boy's eyes as he rushed towards the nothingness of oblivion. He took another step, and then another. He tried to calculate how many deaths could be laid at the door of the woman who now cowered away from him. He was close to her. He could see her sobs of terror. He could smell her fear. She raised her hands, trying to ward him away, but he would not be denied. He lifted the revolver. He felt nothing. His emotions scoured away from his soul. He had killed so many times before. One more death would barely be a blot on his mind, one more stain amidst 1,000. He aimed the gun, filling the simple sight with the face of a woman he had once kissed and caressed with lust and desire. The gun's movement was still smooth, and the chamber moved with greased precision to bring a fresh cartridge under the hammer. He felt the trigger beneath his forefinger, the metal cool against the heat of his flesh. "Stop!" The order cut through the silence. "Do not shoot." The voice of authority wavered slightly as Ballard found the strength to get to his feet. "Jack Lark, I order you to hold your fire." It was the use of his own name that brought Jack up short. It resonated through his being, a tie to a past he barely remembered. The image of a young girl flashed into his mind. She was beautiful. A complex network of pins just about held her unruly curls in place. A few had escaped to whisper across her face. He savoured the image, his memory replaying her smile as she saw him watching her, her lips pursing as she blew the errant hairs away from her face. Yet the girl was dead, the vital spark of her life stolen away. Her eyes stared at him devoid of all life, the blank, sightless stare of death. The girl Jack had loved was dead, and the memory of the grief surged through him. The image fled, and he looked at Sarah Draper. He pictured her face stricken with the same waxy pallor, the same lifeless eyes that would bore into his soul. He shuddered, the nightmare so real that he gasped. He lowered his weapon and closed his eyes against the vision, trying to blot the images from his mind. Ballard stepped past him. He clasped his left hand against the sword cut to his side, the blood oozing past his fingers. Yet he gave no impression of caring about his wounds. He slipped onto the edge of the charpoy, sitting carefully, close to the woman he had come so far to denounce. Chapter 43. Why? Ballard asked the question simply, searching for an answer. Why do all this? Sarah Draper curled her legs up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, and stared into the distance as if seeing nothing. Because I was bored. She spoke suddenly, her words cutting through the silence. She fixed Ballard with an intense stare. You have no idea what life is like for someone like me. I can do nothing. I'm paraded around the place like some damn trinket, an accessory, like the bloody swords you're all so proud of. Ballard eased himself forward. You don't become a spy because you are bored. He spoke gently, but he refused to be thwarted by her attempt to keep up the pretense of being a lady. No. She hung her head. You do that for money. That is all. Ballard seemed genuinely shocked. Ha! Sarah was cruel. You are a man. How could you understand? But what of James? Sarah's mouth puckered in distaste. What of him? Was life with him so very bad? You have no idea. Sarah laughed. It was a bitter, cold sound. He married me because I was pretty. Because he wanted the adornment. I was born poor, and I would have died poor if I had said no. Jack stood in silence. Sarah's words had struck him with more force than her bullet. She was echoing what he had once said of his own life. He had embarked on his long charade to make something of himself, to achieve more than he was allowed. Sarah Draper was claiming to have done the same. She cackled unpleasantly. "You look so shocked." She crooked a finger in Ballard's direction. Ballard shook his head, his hard eyes never leaving hers. "You married a man for money. No, that does not shock me. It is your betrayal of him and of your country that disgusts me." Sarah's eyes blazed in genuine anger as she heard the repulsion in Ballard's voice. "What would you know?" She displayed her scorn openly. "I had nothing. If I had not married him, I would have gone back to the life I had lived before he came along." For a moment there was a trace of pain in her eyes. "I would not return there." Jack struggled with Sarah's confession. Was she any different from him? What would he have done had he not been able to start on his long charade? "So you married an officer for money and for station. But that was not enough for you. So you became a spy. You betrayed the country of your birth for money." Ballard was bitter. He could not imagine the circumstances that would drive anyone, least of all a woman, to sell their soul for so base an ambition. But Jack could. He lived in the shadows where nothing was certain. He knew desperation. Yet he had never turned his back on the country of his birth. No matter what temptation he had faced, he had stayed true to that at least. It was one of the few certainties in his life. Sarah stared into space, lost in the past. It was only when she turned her gaze on Jack that she seemed to come back to herself. "You were a whore," Jack spoke evenly. He came from her world, and he knew. Sarah bit her lip. Her eyes were pitiful. Jack stared at her. He was starting to understand. Ballard was truly the devil, but he did not know everything. Sarah met his gaze. She searched his eyes, her suffering revealed, yet still half hidden behind a mixture of anger and shame. Finally, she nodded. Ballard snorted, but Jack held up his hand, silencing his commander with the gesture. "Where?" "On my back." Her scorn was biting. "London? Does it matter?" Jack sighed. The woman in front of him bore little relation to the fascinating creature who had taken him into her carriage and into her bed. She had infatuated him, tormenting and tantalizing his every thought. Now the veneer of beauty was gone. The ugliness of her life was revealed. Yet it did not repulse him as he sensed it did Ballard, for he understood it. "How old were you when they forced you?" "Old enough." Jack felt his exhaustion pressing down on him. He wanted to lie down, but he forced himself to remain standing, knowing that if he stopped, he would be unable to rise again. "This explains nothing." Ballard hissed the words, the pain of his wound leaving him short of breath. "Be quiet," Jack snapped back. "It explains everything. You don't understand because you've not seen what life is like for people like us. I do not need to see hell to understand the fire." Jack snorted his derision. "You don't have a fucking clue what you're talking about." He still held the revolver in his hand, and the weapon suddenly felt heavy. He tossed it onto Sarah's writing desk. He did not fear Sarah. He pitied her. "I was 11. Sarah spoke quietly. "My ma died." Jack had seen it. His mother's gin palace had had its fair share of whores. Many were young girls. He clasped his left hand around the wound to his arm, pressing his fingers into the torn flesh, trying to stem the flow of blood. The pain seared through him, but it helped to scour away the exhaustion and clear his mind. The Colonel, Draper, he fell for you. Sarah nodded. He was a captain then. Ballard could not stay silent. Now that is a lie. Gentlemen do not take whores for their wives. Jack shook his head. It happens. I've seen it. Sarah was watching Jack closely. He loved me. And he married you. Again she nodded. But someone else knew. Jack felt his knees begin to buckle, and he closed his eyes as he tried to summon some last remnant of strength. Someone knew you were a whore. They used it against you. He spoke quickly, trying to understand it all before he collapsed. That man. Sarah's words were like daggers. He had been with me before, many times. He saw me in Bombay and he worked it out straight away. She looked at Jack, her eyes pleading. I didn't have a choice. He would have ruined James. I couldn't do that to him. You were saving yourself. Ballard interrupted, his venom naked. Do not attempt to pretend to have higher motives. You became a spy to save yourself. Sarah laughed. She fixed Ballard with a piercing stare. There was scorn on her face, loathing. You think I'm the spy? You have no damn idea at all. Ballard did not take kindly to her reaction. He was hurting. You are a spy, and you will hang. The threat silenced her. Ballard stood. He walked to the tent's entrance, stepping around Montford's lifeless corpse. Watch her, Jack. I'll summon the guard. I will not hear any more. This is over. He walked out and into the darkness. It would not take him long to reach Shepherd's headquarters, where he would rouse the guard to secure the spy and keep her safe until she made her final journey to a cold and lonely scaffold. Jack looked at Sarah. He could not find it within himself to hate her. They shared the silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Who is he? Jack broke the spell. He poked the corpse with the toe of his boot, rocking the body that stared at the tent ceiling with lifeless eyes. Sarah smiled. It was thin, weary. She looked drained and exhausted, but life still sparkled in her eyes. Captain Sergei Dmitrievich Sazonov. Jack threw his head and barked a short laugh. A damn Russian. You fools never once suspected anything. Sarah shook her head. She could not share Jack's amusement, but she could tell him the truth. He came with me and not one of you questioned him, just because he spoke with the right accent and looked the damn part. It was so bloody easy. Jack shook with a potent mix of laughter and pain. He was not the only impostor in the army. The idea fascinated him as much as it amused him. He was your link to the Persians? He asked. Sarah shook her head in denial. He was here to watch me. She fixed Jack's eyes with her own. He was my jailer. Jack finally understood. Montford was no guardian. He'd been here to make sure Sarah played the role she had been forced to take. If she had not done as she had been ordered, Jack had no doubt that Montford would have killed her. He thought about what she had said. Despite the agony of his wound, his mind was sharp enough. You're not the spy. He spoke with certainty. It was all starting to make sense. She had been forced to act as she had, the presence of a Russian guardian proof that she was nothing more than a pawn. There had to be someone else. You were just playing a part. Sarah smiled. I always knew you were no ordinary soldier, Arthur. Jack looked at her. So who is the spy? Who is the man who knew you from before? Sarah held his stare. He recognized the fear in her eyes. He watched her gaze flicker over Montford's corpse. Then she looked back at him and saw an unexpected sadness. Her jaw tightened as she made her decision. Featherstone. You let her go? Ballard sat down as he contemplated Jack's astonishing confession. He had returned to the tent to find that Sarah Draper had disappeared. He hissed as he shook his head. Whether at the pain of his wound or his subordinate's rash action, Jack could not tell. She's not the one we're after. Jack picked up his revolver and thrust it back into its holster. His actions were clumsy, his useless right arm hanging at his side. He felt the exhaustion swamp him. It was all he could do to stay on his feet. What? Ballard's eyes flashed in anger. What the devil do you mean? Have you lost your senses? Has the fighting addled what little brain you possessed? He was incredulous. She was not important. Jack's voice was cold. What the bloody hell would you know about it? Ballard was raging now, his anger given full vent. You were here to do what I told you. You were my hired gun, my untraceable killer. I never told you to think. Jack stayed calm in the face of the storm. You once told me it was a job very few people could do. I believed you. Then you were a damn fool. She would have hanged for her crimes. Perhaps you will take her place. Jack was too exhausted to care, even in the face of such a threat. You still need me. What? Ballard rose to his feet, his face twisted with pain and anger. I don't need you. Hired guns are 10 a penny round here. You presume too damn much, Jack Lark. Jack smiled. Sit down. I'll have the guard summon the nearest surgeon. We both need him. You damned viper. Ballard snapped the angry retort before hissing in pain again. But he did as Jack suggested and sat back down heavily. That's better. Jack nodded in approval. Now shut your muzzle and listen to what I have to say before we both bleed to death. He strode across the tent and picked up the pile of letters Sarah had been working on, turning to throw them clumsily onto Ballard's lap. Some light reading for when the surgeon is stitching you up. There'll be nothing much of interest in them. Sarah was a spy. She passed on information. But she's not the one we're after. Ballard sank back on the travel cot. His anger was being driven out by the torment of his wound. Then, who is? Jack faced his commanding officer. Featherstone. Featherstone is the spy. He let Ballard absorb the news. He was certain it would make sense. Ballard would understand, would be able to see how the naval officer's betrayal of his country fitted with everything that had happened. Featherstone had fed them the information about the Munshi. He'd played them along the way, and now he would be laughing at them as they rushed back to denounce a spy who was nothing more than a whore forced to do as she was told. He had planned it all with meticulous care. Yet he had not calculated on the impact of an impostor. Jack sat down and waited for the surgeon. He knew he would have one last task to perform, one job to do before he could move on to a new future. For he was still the devil's assassin, and he would have to kill a spy. Chapter 44. The alleyway stank. Without proper drainage, the townsfolk simply emptied their waste into the streets, which were left littered with the foul and the noxious, the noisome slicks just one of the pitfalls the unwary traveller faced in its barren streets. Jack crouched in the shadows. He flexed his right hand, hissing at the painful spasm the motion sent searing up his arm. The surgeon had fixed him up, stitching together the tears in his flesh, but they had not had time to heal properly, the wounds still raw. His arm felt stiff and was prone to a dreadful cramp that rivaled the ache in his back, keeping him awake the previous night. Not that he minded the lack of sleep, for he knew that if he closed his eyes he would have to face the brutality of his nightmares. In his sleep, his carefully constructed mental barriers would break down, and his mind would replay the battles he had fought. In the depths of the night he would see again the faces of the men he had killed, alongside the images of those he had lost. He waited patiently in the dank alley. He could feel the stitches that held his wound together pulling as he flexed his hand. He had been lucky. Sarah's pistol had lacked the power to kill him, even at such close range. If she had been armed with a modern revolver, Jack knew he would now be dead. He grimaced at the thought. The British Expeditionary Force had made its way back to the main encampment outside Bushire. It had taken them 2 days, the exhausted redcoats struggling through the torrential rain that had barely stopped falling since the last gunshots of the battle had died away. It was a battered and bedraggled column that arrived back at the camp, but the redcoats marched with pride, their victory going a long way to dull the weariness. They had achieved much, and now they could recuperate and gather their strength ready for the next phase of the campaign. But not all the men who had fought on the battlefield at Kushab would be left to enjoy the short peace. For Jack had to complete his bitter task quickly and without delay now that the army had returned. The canker had to be rooted out and destroyed before it could do any more harm. He picked at the wall of the house that backed onto the grim alley. The mud was soft and friable, and he used a fingernail to prise away a tiny white shell that had been buried deep within it. He rolled the shell between his fingers, using it to unlock the muscles in his hand, releasing a little of the tension that he could not shake. He heard footsteps and straightened up, dropping the shell to the ground and easing back into the gloom, hiding his profile in the darkness. He watched as the figure carefully picked its way into the alley. The man he had summoned advanced cautiously, as if not trusting the shadows. It was exactly as Jack had planned. "Sarah?" Jack smiled. The man he had wanted to meet had taken the lure. "Sarah? Are you there?" Jack heard the tetchy note in the hissed challenge. He closed his eyes and inhaled as deeply as his wounds would allow, summoning the strength he would need. Ballard had not forgiven him for letting Sarah Draper go free. He had allowed Jack to put his wild scheme into practice, giving his subordinate a final opportunity to seek redemption. Jack stepped out of the shadows to stand in the meagre light that penetrated the gloom of the alleyway. "Good evening, Commodore." The figure stopped abruptly. It was too dark for Jack to see the reaction on the creased and weather-beaten face, so he walked forward, revealing himself fully to the man who had been tricked into the meeting in the middle of the night. Expecting someone else? Featherstone straightened up. "Captain Fenris." The revolver was heavy in Jack's left hand. "Sarah is not here. Your accomplice has fled the scene." The naval officer smiled. "You tricked me into coming. And you come alone." He sighed. "That tells me you are here to kill me." Jack shook off the chill of the words. He had killed so many men, but never in cold blood. "You're a spy. You knew the risks." His voice was cold, emotionless. "You know the penalty." Featherstone laughed. "Quite true, Jack." Jack started. "How do you know my name?" "It was in Ballard's papers. I rather suspect he left your identity in his documents as some kind of safeguard, just in case you decided to do him in." Featherstone's eyes never once left Jack's face. He stared at him, watchful and calm. "So now he unleashes his killer." The naval officer shook his head, clearly affronted. Perhaps I underestimated him. Perhaps you underestimated all of us. Jack lifted the revolver. Featherstone saw the movement and straightened up, a final display of defiant courage. I think not. A pity. Jack felt the stirrings of anger. I think we could surprise you. Featherstone laughed, his scorn revealed. You think the fact that you are a charlatan should surprise me? What a pathetic creature you are. Better a fraud than a traitor. Jack reacted to the scorn. You are a simple soul, Jack Lark. You cannot understand. You look at my actions and you see betrayal, yet you know nothing. Nothing. For the first time, Featherstone's urbane charm cracked. Do not presume that a man like you can understand a man like me. I understand a spy. I understand that men died a result of your actions. Featherstone shook his head. You understand nothing. What are the lives of a few soldiers? If they didn't die today, they would die tomorrow. They mean nothing. They meant something to me. How very touching, Jack. Is that what this is all about? Did I upset your fragile sensibilities? What an odd notion for a killer. Featherstone took a step closer to Jack. His face stretched with urgency as he tried to explain his actions. Can you truly not lift your gaze and see out of the gutter? You should try to think of a bigger world, one where the lives of a handful of redcoats mean little. Do you think Outram loses sleep over the men he lost? Do you think Wellington wept into his pillow thinking of the thousands who died carrying out his bloody orders? The naval officer spoke with passion now. The revolver was forgotten. Great men cannot think of such things. They must do what they know to be right, and if there is a price to be paid, then so be it. Is that what you are? A great man? It was Jack's turn to be scornful. Perhaps. I don't expect you to understand. You have not seen the world as I have, or watched all those misbegotten fools who are allowed to govern and command when they couldn't even run a common whorehouse. We are a country that values the accident of birth over ability, and it is ruining us. These men fail us, but they're never held to account for their actions simply because they come from the right family. We are a nation of the blind. It is high time our eyes were opened. And that's what you were doing. Opening our eyes. We need to change, Jack. Featherstone spoke with intensity. Before it's too late. We need the best men to lead us, not just someone's bloody son and heir. Men like you. Jack's contempt was clear. Yes, men like me, men bold enough to challenge the status quo. Do you know how many times I have been passed over? How many times I have seen lesser men promoted? And why? Just because some damn admiral crooks his bloody finger, that's why. Merit means nothing. In our world, intelligence is sneered at, ability is mocked. All that bloody matters is what family you come from. Jack heard the bitterness in Featherstone's words, and he understood. He knew what it was to be denied a future by virtue of a low birth. Much of what Featherstone was saying came close to Jack's own opinion of the world in which he served. But it was no excuse for betrayal. For Featherstone was wrong. The lives of the men did matter. The redcoats might have marched with obedience, but they also marched with pride. They came from the lowest rungs of society, yet they were the ones prepared to fight and die for their country. For that, they were owed so much more than their country deigned to give them. They did not deserve such scorn. They did not deserve death. You know you'll hang, don't you, Jack? The Commodore spoke more quickly now, a little of his sang-froid melting as he saw his death approaching in the barrel of Jack's unwavering gun. It's all in Ballard's papers. When you have done what he requires, you'll be hanged. He cannot allow you to live. Do you really not see? It would be too messy. You would be a loose end. No intelligence officer likes loose ends. Jack narrowed his eyes. He ignored the words, focusing his attention on the feel of the trigger beneath his finger. Have you ever seen a man on the scaffold, Jack? I have. It's a terrible sight. Most piss themselves. Their final sorry act on this earth, to soil themselves to the catcalls of the crowd. Can you imagine what it feels like? The scratch of the rope as it twists round your neck. That final rush of terror as the floor drops away and you fall. Jack felt no emotion. He knew what he was and the future he faced. Featherstone's words meant nothing. Then you kick. You cannot help it. Featherstone was speaking urgently now. You jerk and you thrash like a floundering fish as the last of your breath chokes in your throat, and then you die. He paused and looked at Jack, peering into the gloom to see if his words were having any effect. And then you die, he repeated. Alone. His voice rose in desperation. Jack smiled. But not yet. He squeezed the trigger. The gun recoiled, the charge exploding under the hammer. The heavy bullet punched through Featherstone's skull, ending his life in a shower of blood and bone. His body crumpled to the ground like a child's rag doll, arms and legs twisted, the life force snatched away. Jack stared at the body for a long time. He kept his arm extended, aiming the revolver at the man he had been sent to kill, just in case he showed a final flicker of life. But Featherstone was dead. Jack had done his job. He had killed the spy. You can come out now. He spoke into the shadows behind him. Major Ballard, commander of the intelligence department, emerged from the darkness to stand at Jack's shoulder. That was a good shot. Jack grunted. Ballard reached forward. His damaged arm was encased in a black silk sling and a thick bandage was wrapped around his midriff. His drawn features betrayed the pain of the twin wounds that he had received at the hand of Simon Montford, yet still he managed to offer a thin-lipped smile. He clasped his free hand onto his subordinate's shoulder. It had to be done. I thank you. Jack said nothing. He shoved the revolver back into its holster and breathed out the lungful of air that he had been holding since he had fired the single fatal shot. He was lying. I hope you know that. Ballard patted Jack once before walking past him to stare at the corpse. I have no plans to have you killed. He'd better have been lying. I'd come back and haunt you. I'd scare you shitless. Ballard chuckled softly. I'm going to miss you, Jack. Are you sure you won't reconsider? We've only won the first battle. The campaign is not yet done. We'll have more work to do, you and I. Jack shook his head. No, I'm done. Ballard nodded. He looked down at the pathetic remains of the spymaster. Poor Featherstone. I would never have believed that the old boy contained so much passion. He sighed with what appeared to be genuine sadness. We will say he committed suicide. It is an ignoble end for a man like this. Will anyone know the truth? Ballard furrowed his brow. You and I? He paused, pondering the loose ends. Outram, certainly, and we should not forget Mrs. Draper. He shot Jack a disapproving glare, but could not hold the expression for long. That is all. His secret will die with him. It's better that way. Jack nodded. He patted the heavy packet in the inside pocket of his hussar's dolman. It was his reward, the final legacy of his campaign. He might not have been awarded the medals he deserved, the public laurels presented to those officers who had fought with bravery, but he had earned something infinitely more precious. Ballard had made him the gift as recompense for all he had done, It was a reward worth so much more than any tawdry piece of tin. He walked forward and offered his hand. Ballard looked hard into his eyes. He slowly shook his head, as if unable to understand what he saw, before reaching forward and shaking Jack's hand. "I rather think I will see you again, Jack Lark." He smiled as he made his farewell. Jack laughed. He felt the shackles of his imposition fall away. "Not if I see you first." He nodded once and walked past his former commander. He had done what he had been ordered to do, and now he was free. Epilogue. Jack stood on the quayside looking warily at the city that awaited him. The fort loomed over the place just as he remembered, and if he tried hard he could smell the olfactory horror that was the covered bazaar. It was his second visit to Bombay, and he had learnt his lesson. He would not waste any time there. At least he would be in better surroundings than before. He waited patiently for the coach that would usher him into the serene and worldly comforts of the Hope Hall Family Hotel in Mazagon. Thanks to the valuables he had stolen all those weeks ago from Abdul at the Hotel Splendid, he could now afford to stay in comfort, far from the peril of midnight murderers. For the first time, he would be able to register in his own name. Ballard's gift had been a set of freshly issued discharge papers. They vouched that the man carrying them had been allowed to leave the army honourably, freeing him from the ties of the Queen's service. Ballard had given Jack the one thing he had craved for so long. He had given him back his name. A fine carriage pulled up in a jangle of horse tackle and squeaking timbers. The door opened, and a servant dressed in the fine livery of the Hope Hall Hotel jumped from his perch at the rear and raced forward to lower the steps that would allow Jack to enter with dignity. Jack stepped forward, but hesitated as he started up the steps. He remembered the last 2 occasions he had entered an unfamiliar carriage. He shivered at the memories. It was time to move on. He had to leave his past behind. Jack snorted as he scanned the newspaper. The Tehran Gazette usually made for an interesting read, its news more current than even the most recently arrived Times. The paper's fanciful account of the Persian victory at Kushab had made him laugh aloud. The description of the triumphant Persian forces pursuing a broken British army back to the coast read like an account from the distant past, the windy style presenting a clear picture of Persian valour and British cowardice. It was only as he read of the supposed destruction of several British squares that his laughter died, the memory of the slaughter at the real battle too fresh to be a matter for humour. He read with sadness that the Persians claimed to have killed at least 1,000 British soldiers. They also lauded the death of Major General Stalker. Jack had learnt of Stalker's death only 3 days previously. The man who had led the British to victory at Rashir and then commanded the 2 divisions for most of the day at Kushab had killed himself, committing suicide shortly after Jack had left the army. Jack could not begin to understand what could have driven Stalker to such an act at the moment of his greatest success. It was a sad end to a fine career. Despite everything Jack himself had endured, he had never considered the same solution for his own suffering. Even in his loneliest, darkest moments, he had not once thought of lifting his revolver to his head. He would never let himself give in. He'd experienced a different rush of emotion the following day when he had read that Commodore Featherstone of the Indian Navy had also killed himself. He could not help but wonder if anyone would suspect some skullduggery when they learned that 2 of the most senior British officers had killed themselves in such a short space of time after such a fabulous victory. Yet it was no longer his concern, and he forced the thoughts from his mind and sat back in his chair. "Sahib, your carriage is ready," The servant bowed low as he addressed the British officer, who stared into space, clearly lost in a different world. Jack didn't hear the summons. His mind was replaying the moment when he had pulled the trigger and sent Featherstone's corrupt soul to meet its maker. He saw the look in the spy master's eyes as the trigger tightened under his finger, the last moments of the man's life etched into his soul. Sahib? The memory fled back into the recesses of his mind. He snapped the Gazette shut and tossed it to the floor, the only suitable resting place for a newspaper filled with such dross, then pulled himself to his feet, straightening his waistcoat as he stood up. It still felt awkward to be without a uniform, but at least he was no longer an imposter. The ticket on the Peninsular and Oriental steamer was made out in the name of one Jack Lark, Esquire. He had booked passage on the first ship out of Bombay, not wanting to risk staying a moment longer than was necessary in the city where he had lived as Arthur Fenris. The steamer was bound for Calcutta, where he would have to wait before he could board another P&O ship that would take him to Suez. From there, he would travel overland to Cairo to pick up the last connection in his long journey. For Jack had decided it was time to return to the one place where he could be himself. He was going home.